She's clearly hasn't. Maybe she doesn't have a passport. Maybe she doesn't study geography. Maybe she doesn't know history. But Venezuela is clearly in our backyard. And maybe she hasn't heard. Maybe she's never heard of the Monroe Doctrine, which has kind of governed and helped guided U.S. foreign policy for 100 plus years. Venezuela and the stability of the region in the Caribbean, South America, the oil reserves, all the things that Venezuela, just democracy in the region, all those things are incredibly important to America in the short term and the long run. The Trump administration should be applauded for what they did. And listen, the administration can walk and chew gum. They're going to have to address all those things that she's talking about. They're going to have to address, the quote unquote affordability issues that are being talked about, right? But this is a good thing for democracy. It's a good thing for the people of Venezuela, the people in South America, and it puts dictators and bad guys on notice all over the world. You can't continue to do what you do. The Biden administration talked about it. The Trump administration had a bounty on this gentleman's head, and finally President Trump took action and limited action. And there's obviously a lot yet to be written, but things look good so far.
Lulu, I want to get your thoughts on the politics of this, but I also want to let our viewers know you've covered Latin America extensively throughout your career. So you have a lot of expertise on this and a lot of history. So I want to know what you think about the politics about this, but also what has stood out to you over the last day and a half.
I think that this has been shocking. And I think, to David Irvin's point, clearly Venezuela is in the national interest of the United States and what happens there. And clearly, there has been a sense for a very long time that the United States has ignored Latin America and only really focused on it when there were issues to do with immigration or drugs. The broader question here, though, is what is this actually about? And, we have more questions than answers. When we saw President Trump speaking yesterday, he was all over the place. I mean, he was talking about taking over Venezuela. And now we see his cabinet, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, having to walk that back. What does it mean to say that the United States will be sort of in control of a huge South American country? What does that mean for the sovereignty of those nations that we rely on for trade, for cooperation with those big problems that we face here in America, like immigration? Again, to David Irvin's point, what it actually also says to the world is that the United States is going to take unilateral action without really consulting their allies and friends. And that really does change the world order in a substantial way. So I think we're in uncharted territory here. And indeed, I think there's a lot yet to be written.
Yeah, and David, look, Lulu brings up a key point that I keep hearing over and over again, which is, okay, now what? What's the plan? And, we had this polling from CBS that found about 70% of Americans opposed U.S. military action in Venezuela, that a majority of people didn't understand why we would take action there. So all of that being said, how critical is it for the Trump administration to explain this properly, not just to Congress and others, but to the American people?
Yeah, I think that explanation isn't necessarily. I think it's going to have to. It's what's going to actually happen in the coming weeks, days, weeks, and months in Venezuela is going to dictate those numbers, right? Oppose, favor, what's going to happen with the people in Venezuela, the Diaspora, the Venezuelans who fled Venezuela over the past, decade or so as the Venezuelan economy collapsed to Colombia and other places in South and Central America and the United States. So the administration is going to have to explain in the short term what their objectives are and how they're going to attain that. But to just push back on Lou a little bit, unilateral action in the Western Hemisphere is something that's been, again, with the Monroe Doctrine, and then you had the Roosevelt, the corollary, and then the Kennedy kind of push with Cuba and missiles in the Western Hemisphere. There are certain things that are so clearly within our interest.
All those things have happened, but what were the effects of those things? I mean, none of those things are shining bright examples of, great statecraft of the United States. And in fact, what we saw with Cuba, for example, is that a lot of the intervention led to the rise of people like Fidel Castro. And so
Yeah, but we didn't have a nuclear war, Lulu, is what happened.
Is that the focus only happens when there is military intervention instead of partnership and working with governments to try and shore up those democracies. I agree with you. I have been to Venezuela multiple times, and what has happened there has been a tragedy. It has been the biggest refugee crisis in the hemisphere. 8 million people ended up leaving that country over the disastrous Maduro regime.
What you agree? So what you agree, it's a net positive, what just occurred, what the Trump administration just undertook is a net positive for Venezuela and for the region. You can admit it, it's okay.
See. No, I don't know what it's going to be. Because this is the thing. If you remember President Bush sitting under a banner saying mission accomplished after the invasion of Iraq, and that statue fell down, I was there that day, and it seemed like a net positive then too, but it wasn't. And so the history gets written not in days. As you know, as a military man, it gets written in weeks and months and in years. And so we don't know where this is going.
Okay, we're going to have to. David, I'll give you a quick.
I would suspect the people going to bed in Venezuela tonight are much happier than they were under the Maduro regime. That's all I would say.
We are one day out now from what was a chaotic and unrelenting news day. From the first reports of explosions Saturday morning in Venezuela's capital city of Caracas to President Trump posting on social media the U.S. military was behind that operation, to the perp walk in New York of Venezuela's ousted president. The news media was scrambling to keep up as things developed throughout the day. Let's examine how the media is covering this fast-moving and consequential story. We'll bring in CNN chief media analyst Brian Stelter. Brian, great to see you. I was reading your newsletter this morning that went through a lot of this. It was really fascinating to kind of take a beat and think about it all. What really sticks out to you over the last, I guess we'll call it 36 hours at this point, but it's been quite remarkable.
One, thank goodness for the reporters who are on the ground in Venezuela right now. You know, Venezuela is a repressive regime. The government has been hostile to the press for decades, but a small number of reporters are able to work there, and they're so essential right now, including some of our colleagues who we've been seeing on CNN this weekend, both for alerting the world to the explosions on Saturday morning, but now to help us all hear what Venezuelans are thinking, what they're asking, what they're feeling. It seems to me that questions are as important as answers right now. Answers are in short supply, but it's crucial to ask the right, proper, skeptical questions. And that's what we're seeing from the White House press corps yesterday at the news conference and all across television in the dialogues today. Is the U.S. at war with Venezuela? Do Venezuelans think the U.S. is at war? Is there a clear U.S. plan? You know, we've seen media reports in the past that have described these U.S. war game scenarios about U.S. action in Venezuela, and none of the war game scenarios ended well. All of them ended badly, suggesting the country would collapse into chaos. So what can be learned from those war game plans? You know, can Trump reshape Venezuela now just with words or with actions? And what will those actions be? He's just given another interview, this time to the New York Post, where he talks again about running the country. He says we need to run it well, run it with strength. He says he will be able to pick the new leader in the future. All of this rhetoric, you know, right now it's words. Will it be translated to actions? And I think it seems to me, Jessica, these questions are ultimately in service of U.S. troops and in service of citizens. And it's not lost on reporters and editors that some of these questions were not amplified well enough in the aftermath of 9/11. Very different time, very different place now, but those memories of regime change 10, 15, 20 years ago are clearly on people's minds today.
Yeah, and you mentioned Trump talking to the New York Post. I know he's been picking up the phone and just talking to reporters who are calling him. Obviously, he had that news conference yesterday. How is that different from what we normally see from presidents? And also, it is unique to President Trump.
Well, there's two elements about this. Number one, you and I spoke last fall about the Pentagon trying to reshape the press corps. Most major U.S. news outlets left the Pentagon and refused to follow along with restrictive new rules. Pete Hegseth made noise about reporters, being a problem at the Pentagon and endangering national security, and he brought in MAGA media voices and commentators instead. Well, this weekend, it has been all about those old-fashioned global news brands that have been breaking news and leading the way, not those Pentagon-approved MAGA media figures who have not been advancing this story at all. It has been those old-line outlets that have been leading the way, and that includes with covering what Trump is saying and arguing about this. He picked up the phone and talked to the New York Times in the middle of the night on Saturday. He talked to the Atlantic earlier today, the New York Post, and that press conference was widely attended by many news outlets, and even though many of Trump's answers were vague. It was the questions that really mattered, because those reporters were speaking on behalf of both the American people, but also folks all around the world. And it's also notable the Trump administration is really trying to control the message by funneling information through the White House. The Pentagon has mostly gone silent. The typical press people, the officials who would normally be engaging with the press, they're mostly referring questions to the Trump White House. And that's a change from past practices. It's something to keep an eye on in the days to come, as people are going to have more and more questions about the U.S. military presence in and around Venezuela. For example, the troops who were injured reportedly in this mission, what are their conditions? Those kinds of questions. Information is being centralized and consolidated by Trump in the White House. And it seems in some ways he can do his press himself. He's picking up the phone, talking to reporters, saying again this afternoon that he plans to run Venezuela. And as you've been covering, Jessica, that just raises a whole host of questions that people have.
Yeah, people have a lot more questions around that, but it is certainly interesting to see that he does keep engaging with the press. We are hearing it directly from the president himself. All right, Brian Stelter, always good to see you. Thank you so much. Congress is set to return to Washington this week with a budget deadline quickly approaching, and the Trump administration's actions in Venezuela over this weekend all looming. Lawmakers going to be plenty busy. California Republican Congressman Kevin Kiley is here with us now. Congressman, thanks for your time tonight. We really appreciate it. I do want to start first with Venezuela. There has been a lot of talk and, frankly, outrage from some of your Democratic colleagues and others on the Hill about the lack of consent from Congress, bringing Congress into this really at all before this operation took place. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, and also if you would support this legislation that would restore more power to Congress in these situations.
Yeah, so I've read, dozens and dozens of reactions from people here in the U.S. and across the world. And, you notice they follow a similar formula for those who are critical of what happened. It always begins with Maduro was a really bad guy, but. So I'd like to focus first on what people are all agreeing on, what comes before the but, which is that he is someone who has wreaked havoc on his own people, has caused immense harm to the United States and to the international order. And so whatever you might think about the question you asked, there is a corresponding opportunity here to create a better future for the people of Venezuela, for our own citizens, and for the world at large. I think that there is also broad agreement across party lines that from this point forward, Congress needs to be centrally involved in whatever role the United States has in ushering in a better future and a better political arrangement in Venezuela, and giving them, the freedom and democracy and self-determination that they deserve. As to the question of the strike itself and the lack of approval by Congress leading up to it, I'm someone who always wants Congress to be informed as much as possible. Under traditional legal frameworks, that's when the president's powers are at their highest ebb. But for an operation like this, that was predicated on secrecy, there are circumstances where that just isn't possible, where it puts the mission at risk, where it puts our service members at risk.
So it sounds like you were okay in this situation with how they handled it, that you don't think the Gang of Eight or a smaller group from Congress should have been notified previous.
Well, since the primary justification was a legal one, that this is an individual who is under indictment for causing immense harm to American citizens, the Biden administration offered a $25 million reward for his arrest. And then beyond that, the president does have inherent authority as commander-in-chief for these sort of smaller scale operations that there's plenty of precedent for in this region and in operations around the world. I think that, there was justification for undertaking this, and there was a very compelling reason for not having, prior congressional approval in a way that would have undermined the success of the operation.
Yeah. And so would you be in favor, because respectfully, I think there are many people out there who don't think this was a small scale operation. Would you be in favor of legislation that would give more power back to Congress? Is that something you'd work on with Democrats?
Well, yes, I do think Congress needs to be centrally involved going forward in terms of what comes next. So, of course, it would depend what the legislation looks like. But I think that's a sentiment that you'll find is widely shared across party lines, that, in whatever role the United States plays in ushering freedom and democracy and prosperity for the people of Venezuela who have suffered so much under Maduro and his predecessor, that's something that Congress needs to be centrally involved in. And I've also said kind of more broadly, not just on issues related to foreign policy, but on all policy matters, that the House of Representatives in particular needs to get back in the driver's seat when it comes to tackling the challenges facing our country. The House wasn't even in session for 2 months. I was very critical of that decision by the House Speaker. I actually went to D.C. This was during the shutdown to try to advocate for bringing the House back and kind of having the House take more of a lead in policy. So that's something that I am encouraging our leadership to do once we come back here this coming week.
So in keeping with that theme, and you noted this, the president now saying that the U.S. will run Venezuela, Marco Rubio saying today that that has to do with the policy, but obviously having a heavy hand in what comes next in Venezuela. So what role should Congress be playing in that?
Well, Congress should be centrally involved in the major decisions as far as the role that the United States undertakes and the sort of political arrangement that we endeavor to ultimately put in place. In the short term, obviously, the imperative needs to be stability. With the head of state no longer there, it's obviously a time when there are various risks that could emerge. And so I know these issues have been well thought through. I know there have been lines of communication with the now interim president. So in the very short term, that needs to be the priority. Of course, in the hopefully not very long term, but for the durable future, we need to see what we can do to usher in an arrangement built upon self-determination and democracy and freedom. That's ultimately what will allow Venezuela as a country to prosper. It's in the interest of the United States. It's in the interest of the Western Hemisphere and the entire international order.
And it still remains to be seen if that means, if that will include the U.S. military being deployed on the ground there in a long-term manner. Is that something you would support?
Well, as the Secretary of State said today, obviously we don't want that sort of thing, but you can never rule out options as far as what the commander-in-chief would do. The entire premise of peace through strength is that you retain the capacity to act in a way that will, achieve your objectives. But hopefully you don't ultimately have to use the bigger tools in your toolkit in order to do so. So, ideally, we can have a period here where there is stability, followed by a transition to a democratic government. We know that Maduro stole the last election. This is recognized by the Trump administration, the Biden administration, the European Union, that he was not the legitimate leader of that country. And so this is an opportunity to restore legitimacy and to create a much better future for people in that country that have been just utterly impoverished under his disastrous narco-terrorist regime.
Tonight, Venezuelan leader Nicolás Maduro in custody here in New York as he awaits his initial court appearance. The Southern District saying that will take place tomorrow in a Manhattan federal courtroom. And it all comes after U.S. forces captured Maduro and his wife during that massive operation inside the Latin American country early yesterday morning. We are following this from all angles tonight. CNN's Julia Benbrook and Natasha Bertrand are both joining us now. Natasha, I want to start first with you and what more you're hearing about the Trump administration's plans in Venezuela. There are so many questions around what comes next there.
Well, it seems that for right now, the administration is prioritizing kind of administrative stability and repairing the country's oil infrastructure over an immediate turn to democracy. And this was reported in a great piece by my colleagues Kevin Liptak and Kristen Holmes earlier today, which basically says that the U.S. now is trying to use the leverage that it has over Venezuela, both economically and militarily. Of course, that armada of U.S. warships is still in the Caribbean in order to pressure the current transitional leader, who is Delcy Rodríguez, who was Maduro's deputy, in order to do the bidding of the United States. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio, he said earlier today that the U.S. running the country in the way that President Trump alluded to yesterday actually has more to do with the administration using its leverage to influence policy than it does to actually having Americans on the ground running the day-to-day operations of the government. But here's a bit of what he said.
Well, it's not running, it's running policy. The policy with regards to this, we want Venezuela to move in a certain direction because not only do we think it's good for the people of Venezuela, it's in our national interest. It either touches on something that's a threat to our national security or touches on something that's either beneficial or harmful. This is a team effort by the entire national security apparatus of our country, but it is running this policy. And the goal of the policy is to see changes in Venezuela that are beneficial to the United States, first and foremost, because that's who we work for, but also we believe beneficial for the people of Venezuela who have suffered tremendously.
So the administration obviously is trying to use its economic leverage primarily through that oil blockade that it has been enforcing against Venezuela, oil sanctions. It is trying to convince American oil companies to go back into Venezuela, given what they believe will be a period of relative stability, or what they hope will be a period of stability. But obviously there are going to be a lot of questions about just how receptive Delcy Rodríguez actually is to that, given her prior remarks that have cast some doubt on whether or not she's going to be as pliant as the administration wants.
And Julia, turning to you now, the president is headed back from Palm Beach, where he's been for the holiday season. He's headed back to the White House. What has he been saying today?
That's right. He's on his way back from his Mar-a-Lago resort. He spent the last couple of weeks for the holiday there, and that is where he watched this complex operation which led to the arrest of ousted Venezuelan leader Nicolás Maduro play out. And while there are still a lot of questions, we're starting to get a bit of a clearer picture of what Trump meant when he made that stunning statement that the United States would run the country until there is a judicial transition. He was pressed and pressed on exactly what that is going to look like, and he said that some of the top administration officials that were standing behind him, that included Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth as well as Secretary of State Marco Rubio, would be involved. He was also asked specifically about Venezuela's opposition leader, the Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Corina Machado, and if they were in conversations with her potential to lead. And he essentially ruled that out, saying that he didn't believe that she had the support and respect within Venezuela needed to step in. He did say, though, that the United States was in conversations with Venezuela's vice president, Delcy Rodríguez, who is in that acting role now, but she has made several comments calling for the immediate release of Maduro and saying that she does believe he is the legitimate leader. So lots of potential complications there. Now, top U.S. officials have been working, including Rubio, to develop a structure for Venezuela's government going forward, and he gave several TV interviews throughout the morning. He was pressed on if he sees Rodríguez as a legitimate leader. I want you to take a listen to what he had to say.
This is not about the legitimate president. We don't believe that this regime in place is legitimate via an election, and that's not just us. It's 60-something countries around the world that have taken that view as well, including the European Union. But we understand that there are people in Venezuela today who are the ones that can actually make changes. So, for example, when we want to send in the migrant flights, even though we've never recognized the Maduro regime as legitimate, we had to deal with the authorities that controlled the airport. We had to deal with the people who had guns and the people who had control of the airports. We had to deal with them to achieve these objectives. That's different from recognizing their legitimacy.
And to the point of, would Rodríguez take the steps that Trump and his administration want her to take? He offered this stark warning in an interview with The Atlantic earlier today. He said, quote, if she doesn't do what's right, she is going to pay a very big price, probably bigger than Maduro. And as I mentioned, he's coming back from this holiday time in Florida, where he has been intensely focused on foreign issues since Christmas. He has hosted Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, as well as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He's returning, though, with a lot of domestic issues top of mind as well, and there are going to be even more questions coming from Capitol Hill about what has taken place regarding Maduro as we expect him in court sometime tomorrow.
All right, Julia Benbrook at the White House and Natasha Bertrand there in D.C. Thanks to both of you for that reporting. Democratic lawmakers holding an emergency meeting today on that operation in Venezuela. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer saying he's going to push for legislation to require congressional approval before any additional military action in Venezuela. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries calling the operation an act of war. I want to bring in Senator Chris Coons, a Democrat of Delaware, to talk more about that. Senator, thank you so much for being here with us. I really appreciate it. I know that there has been a lot of outrage from your colleagues over the lack of communication and consent, no consent really from Congress prior to this operation. What do you think about that?
Well, thanks for a chance to be on, Jessica. It's been a remarkable period here. First, I'll just express gratitude that no Americans were killed, that our military carried out this operation flawlessly. And I recognize that there's many Venezuelans celebrating the removal of Maduro, a truly brutal authoritarian who misused the resources and harmed the people of Venezuela. But what is alarming to me, what has angered me and many others of my colleagues, is that President Trump and his senior national security team wasn't open and honest with us about their plans. For months, they said that the strikes against boats in the Southern Caribbean were all about drug trafficking and drug interdiction, and they had no plan for overthrowing Maduro or for sending the U.S. military into Venezuela. Now that they have done so, sent the military in, captured Maduro, returned him to the United States, it seems today they're just making this up as they go along. President Trump has no more well-developed plan for how to lead or govern or manage Venezuela than he does how to deliver health care for the American people or how to move forward in resolving the war in Ukraine or the suffering of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. There are too many circumstances where they're making it up as they go along. And we will have a vote, Jessica, in the Senate this week to require congressional consent for any ongoing larger scale military action, because in recent times when we've overthrown dictators, whether in Libya or in Iraq, with no clear plan for what would happen afterwards, the consequences were terrible for the people of the country and costly for the American service members who we ended up asking to go in and fix it once we'd broken it.
So this vote you're saying is coming up this week. I'm curious what you've heard from your Republican colleagues. Obviously, you all are in the minority in both the House and the Senate. Do you believe that you'll get support on this from your Republican colleagues?
Senator Paul is a co-sponsor of the resolution. I don't know if there will be other Republicans who will vote for it. I think likely not. Look, most Americans view this through the lens that President Trump has been offering. This is about drug interdiction. Even though just a few weeks ago, he pardoned the former president of Honduras who trafficked hundreds of tons of cocaine into the United States. And President Trump, in his press conference, basically said this was about getting access to Venezuela's oil and has threatened in a tone that frankly sounds more like a mob boss than it does like the president of a democracy, Delcy Rodríguez, the vice president, that if she doesn't go along with what we want, there's going to be terrible consequences for her. What I didn't hear from President Trump or frankly Secretary Hegseth or Secretary Rubio was a press for political prisoners to be released, for there to be recognition of the opposition leader who won the Nobel Peace Prize, for there to be free and fair elections, or a peaceful transition. Most of what President Trump has focused on is access to their oil and threatening the current leadership with further military action. That's what's opening the door to a very risky next chapter with no clear plan from this administration.
And so if you have this vote and this measure does not pass and you don't get additional powers when it comes to consent, and the president still saying that the U.S. is now running Venezuela, laying out what you just said there, what could potentially involve, what can Congress do about it? What role will you have?
Well, first, it's laughable to think that we could actually run Venezuela. It is a country twice the size of California with 25 million people, active domestic armed guerrilla groups, complex gangs and narco-trafficking. So the idea that we could run Venezuela any more than we could run Iraq at the cost of sending 100,000 troops there, frankly defies credibility. But second, if Republicans step up and do their job as the Article 1 power and say that there shouldn't be further military action without our consent, there's a lot we can do. If Republicans fold their arms and say, nope, we're willing to let President Trump do whatever he wants with our military overseas, with no clear evidence of an imminent threat, then I think folks around the world will be even more anxious. Our trusted ally, Denmark, will wonder what it means when Trump continues to make threats against Greenland. Our ally, Panama, will wonder what it means when he threatens Panama. Heck, even Canada has reason to worry if there's no checks or balances provided by the Republicans in the Senate.
I want to focus, lastly, come back to just Venezuela right now, because in January of 2025, the Biden administration raised the bounty on Maduro to $25 million, to which the Trump administration then raised it to $50 million. Clearly, both administrations wanted him captured. They wanted him arrested. Republicans have argued Trump just went ahead and did it, that he took action. What do you say to that thinking?
So look, there is precedent for our capturing a dictator of a foreign country and returning him to the United States to stand trial. This was the case of Manuel Noriega. Immediately following that, the duly elected president was sworn in because Noriega was using military force to maintain control of Panama. It was a brief, concise military action. One could argue it also needed congressional approval. But I think what is most alarming about this moment is that shambolic press conference by President Trump yesterday, where he said these guys, and points to Hegseth and Rubio, are going to be running Venezuela, which clearly was news to them. And he said, we have no hesitation putting more boots on the ground. And today he threatened further military action against the Venezuelan people through their vice president. I'm concerned about the lack of a plan for how to move forward without threatening violence or occupying Venezuela. I'll remind you, we have a huge armada of U.S. naval vessels, and it took 150 American aviators and planes to carry out this mission. This is an expensive and complex military operation, and it will not produce significant benefits to the United States or American oil companies for years to come. So frankly, the bottom line here is, President Trump, what's your goal? Are you trying to restore democracy? Are you trying to interdict drugs? Are you trying to access oil? And how much of a price are you asking American service members, our men and women who serve us around the world to keep us safe, to make in order to achieve whatever your actual goal is?
That. Eric Farnsworth joins us now. He's a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also a former State Department official covering Latin America. Eric, thank you for being here with us on this Sunday. We appreciate it. We just heard from our colleague there, David Culver, who's obviously in the neighboring country of Colombia. How might this operation and and the fallout from it, what's going on in Venezuela, affect other countries in the region?
It could affect it directly because Venezuela, for a number of years, has essentially been a collapsing country. 1/4 of the entire population of 33 million, now 8 million Venezuelans are outside the country, and that's happened long before yesterday's activities. But the fear is that if the remaining Venezuelan people in the country don't have sustained hope that things are going to get better, and that it's not just Maduro, but actually other senior officials from his regime are going to leave, and that their lives will get better, there is fear that indeed you could have an additional migration flow, and that would go directly into the neighboring countries like Colombia, like Brazil, and like countries in the Caribbean. So this is directly implicating some of the neighbors. There are other issues too, but that's, for the moment, that's the primary one.
And Eric, how quickly does this all need to kind of shake out and stabilize?
Yeah, that's a really important question. I don't have a specific time frame, but I would say sooner rather than later. For example, both the president-elect Edmundo Gonzalez and Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Corina Machado are outside of Venezuela. One would assume that they're going to return to Venezuela at some point relatively soon. That would certainly be a boost of energy and support for the opposition and for the government-elect. But the longer it appears as if Delcy Rodríguez is going to remain as the de facto leader of the country, and some of the officials around her, like Diosdado Cabello and the head of the military, Pedrino Lopez, some of those people who have bounties, $25 million bounties remaining on their heads, the Venezuelan people, I think, are going to begin to question, well, what is the ultimate outcome of this? So I think even if there isn't a direct change in the next couple days or even weeks, I don't know, but there is going to have to be some really intensive signaling from the White House and from the State Department that fundamental change really is on the way, and it's not just about Maduro, but it's about his regime.
The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has said that Maduro's arrest and bringing him to the U.S. is not related to Venezuela's oil infrastructure. President Trump has said that he does want the U.S. oil industry to thrive in Venezuela again and is focused on that. How much of a role do you think oil played in all of this?
Well, I can tell you how much oil is going to play in the future. I mean, Venezuela can't recover unless the oil industry recovers, because that is literally the engine of growth and recovery for the country. And so whatever happens, there's going to have to be a lot of intensive attention to recapturing the energy sector, to revitalize it and to restore it. And I think that's absolutely legitimate. Look, the bounty on Maduro's head, $50 million, the indictments for him of being a drug trafficker and allegations of crimes against humanity at the International Court of Justice, that has nothing to do with oil. But the idea that oil is an engine of recovery does mean that the sector has to be recovered, and it does have to be revitalized.
You posted that many analysts are overlooking the strength of the Venezuelan people. You said, quote, "Give them hope and they will rebuild a broken nation." Explain that to us and what you think it will take to rebuild.
It will require hope. Again, a real confidence that this time is different, that change is here. It's going to take a lot of effort. It's going to take a lot of money. But the Venezuelan people are entrepreneurial. They love their country, and there are any number of folks in the diaspora, folks who have left Venezuela, professional class, educated entrepreneurs who are itching to get back to the country. And if they're given a chance to get back and really help re-energize the economy, I really think they're going to have an opportunity to do that, and they're going to succeed. But we have to recognize the difficulty in doing that. We have to recognize that this is a long-term issue. It's not going to happen tomorrow. And unless the situation stabilizes in terms of the investment climate, in terms of the authorities, in terms of who has the ability to sign and enforce a contract, for example, and what does that mean until the infrastructure gets somehow rebuilt, you're going to have some caution about people wanting to return as well, and investors will probably be a little bit cautious as well. So this is going to take time. But the Venezuelan people are entrepreneurial, and they're absolutely committed to restoring the country if they're given the chance and if they're given the hope to be able to do so.
How delicate would you say the situation is there right now of it tipping one way or the other, the way, that it could go sideways or that it could go in the more positive route that you're saying a lot of Venezuelans, of course, would hope for?
I'm an optimist. I believe that certainly that is a real option, and probably better than we've seen in any number of years, but it could absolutely go sideways, and it could go sideways quickly. And I think what the key indicator here is really the security forces. Until there is a signal that Delcy Rodríguez is not going to be the long-term leader of the country and that the regime really is in its last days, I think you're going to have a number of commanders and folks who are involved in the security forces, not just the military, but the broader security forces as well, hedging their bets. Who's going to throw in their lot with a group of folks if you don't know what their future is? So I think that has to clarify. And once it does, I think we're going to start seeing some of the military try to decide, well, where is my future best served and who should I best support? Until that decision is made, you're really going to have continued uncertainty, and you're going to have some real challenges.
You're in the CNN newsroom. Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Dean here in New York, and we begin this hour with the latest on the capture of Nicolás Maduro. The Southern District of New York says the ousted Venezuelan leader's initial court appearance is set for tomorrow. He's currently being held at a federal detention center here in New York. Maduro and his wife, of course, taken by U.S. forces during a major military operation inside the Latin American country early Saturday morning. And when touting the raid's success, President Donald Trump told reporters the United States would run Venezuela in the interim. Secretary of State Marco Rubio looked to clarify that in an interview earlier today.
President Trump said we're going to run the country. So is it you? Is it Secretary Hegseth? Who are those people who will be running the country specifically?
Well, it's not running, it's running policy. The policy with regards to this. We want Venezuela to move in a certain direction because not only do we think it's good for the people of Venezuela, it's in our national interest.
CNN senior White House reporter Kevin Liptak is joining us now from West Palm Beach. And Kevin, the president seems to be upping that pressure on Venezuela's acting president. What is he saying today?
Yeah, and this is kind of a striking back and forth between the Trump administration and Delcy Rodríguez, the former vice president of Venezuela, who President Trump just yesterday identified as the likely new leader and as someone who, in his words, would make Venezuela great again. She, after that, went on to really decry the raid that ousted Maduro, claimed that Maduro was still the leader there, and said that the U.S. was acting unlawfully. So it does set up this dissonance. And what the president said today in an interview with the Atlantic magazine was issuing a threat. He says if she doesn't do what's right, she is going to pay a very big price, probably bigger than Maduro. So really kind of upping the pressure on Rodríguez to essentially accede to what the U.S. wants to do here. And that, at the end of the day, does appear to be what the president means by the U.S. running Venezuela. We are getting a sort of a better picture of what the president's intentions in all of this are, including from Marco Rubio, who was out on the Sunday shows today. This is not, a U.S. occupation of Venezuela akin to what we saw in Iraq. This is really more of a coercion campaign. The U.S. really relying on the leverage it thinks it has on the remnants of the Maduro regime to essentially do what the United States tells them to do. And the leverage includes, of course, that massive military buildup which remains in place in the Caribbean Sea, but also the oil blockade that the president has ordered, insisting that oil tankers not be able to go in and out of Venezuela. So that seems to be where all of this is heading today, Jessica.
Yeah, and the president, Kevin, also saying that there was a possibility, left open the possibility, that the U.S. could put boots on the ground in Venezuela. What more have we heard about that in the last 24 hours since he left that door open?
Yeah, and that was sort of one of the most striking developments in that press conference yesterday. I asked him, does he envision a prolonged U.S. military presence in Venezuela? And he pivoted immediately to talking about the country's oil reserves. And that, I think, seems to be where that is headed as well. The president has long had this preoccupation with Venezuela's oil, the world's largest proven oil reserves. And he seems to be suggesting that if the U.S. military goes back into that country, it would be to ensure that the U.S. interests are protected and that U.S. oil companies gain access to that infrastructure. Of course, the president has also said that there could be a second, potentially larger strike on Venezuela if the country's leaders don't accede to U.S. demands. So still, I think, somewhat vague about what the role of the U.S. military will be going forward.
Yeah, more to come on that. Kevin Liptak for us live in Florida. Thank you so much for that. Meantime, the ousted Venezuelan president is currently being held at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. And when he appears in court tomorrow, it will be in front of United States District Judge Alvin K. Hellerstein in Manhattan. CNN Chief Law Enforcement and Intelligence Analyst John Miller is joining us now. And John, getting Maduro into that detention center was tightly secured. We were talking with you as they were moving him around the city of New York yesterday. What can we expect to see tomorrow?
We can expect to see more of the same. Every time they move President Maduro or former President Maduro, you're going to see a secure package, as they refer to it, a motorcade with armored vehicles and counter-assault teams. And escorts by highway patrol because of the high threat nature of the case. And when they had the El Chapo case, you saw that move happen every day from Manhattan, where he was held in jail, to Brooklyn, where the courthouse is. In this case, because that jail was closed as a result of the Epstein suicide and some lapses there, you're going to see the opposite here, which is now the jail's in Brooklyn and the courthouse is in Manhattan. So you're going to see that secure package move every time he has to go to court. And when it goes to trial, you'll see that every day.
That'll be something. Does he have an attorney at this point? Do we know who it will be?
So Nikki Brown, one of our producers, just logged onto and off of the PACER system, which is the federal court record system that's accessible online. So far, no notice of appearance. So if he has an attorney, that attorney has not filed that notice. Now, that may happen tomorrow. Or, Jessica, it is entirely possible that the man who was the day before yesterday the leader of a 30 million person country may end up having a public defender, a federal defender appointed by the court, until who his lawyer is, who is paying for that lawyer, and how is sorted.
That's remarkable. Do we have a timeline for how long this process might take, when we might see a trial?
Well, this case has been going on. The investigation, dates back to 25 years. The investigation itself has been going on years, but his first appearance before the U.S. justice system will be tomorrow in front of Judge Hellerstein. Judge Hellerstein is a very experienced jurist. He's 92 years old. He's been with parts of this case, other parts of it with other defendants, for a number of years himself. But generally, the time between that initial appearance and when a trial is in a regular case is a year. This is an immensely complex case with a lot of discovery and a lot of witnesses, so it could be even more.
Science and cooperation.
Joining us now, CNN senior military analyst Admiral James Stavridis, who's formerly the NATO Supreme Allied Commander. He's also a partner of the Carlyle Group, an investment firm. Good to see you on this Sunday. There are still a lot of questions about what President Trump meant when he said the U.S. will be running Venezuela. We saw there Rubio trying to clarify this morning. What do you think it means?
I think Marco Rubio did the best with a bad hand of cards today, but what he clarified, Jessica, was we're not actually running the country, meaning we're not going to decide when the traffic lights come on and off and what the central bank is going to do, but we're going to, quote, run the policy. What I think he means is put pressure on the current regime, which is a remnant of the Maduro regime, to kind of do the right thing. Whether they're willing to do that or not is going to be where this entire exercise turns. Final thought here. We talk a lot about boots on the ground. That's important. Don't forget, we've got 15,000 boots at sea on aircraft carriers, big amphibious ships. We have a lot of influence and a lot of capability. I think that we're going to put pressure on the current Maduro remnant to get them to move to the right place. And perhaps over time, what I heard Secretary of State Marco Rubio talk about, perhaps over time we can get to that democratic opposition. I certainly hope so. We need to do that.
Did that alarm you when the president said that? And now we've had about a little over 24 hours to kind of think about it and hear more from Rubio, et cetera.
Absolutely alarmed me, and it alarmed anybody who fought in the forever wars. As you know, I spent a great deal of time commanding our entire mission in Afghanistan, which was all about trying to take a very unruly, difficult place and bend it toward Western norms. That's hard to do. And so when President Trump said yesterday, hey, we grabbed Nicolás Maduro, we brought him back, I was okay with that. He's a felon from American justice. I understand that. He sends drugs to America. I get that. Then he hit the part about we're going to run Venezuela. That worried me a lot. I think it worried a lot of Americans. Now we're trying to kind of walk that back. take a coercive response, which says to the current Maduro remnants, this is led by former Vice President of Venezuela, Rodriguez, and tell her, hey, wake up, recognize the reality here, and start bending toward Western agreements. If they can do that, if Rubio can do that, I think that's a reasonable outcome here. Final thought, this could go sideways entirely. This is a country of 30 million people. It's huge, twice the size of California. It is got a lot of different cross currents going on. I'm very worried.
And the president also mentioned what he called the Monroe Doctrine, riffing off the Monroe Doctrine. I'm curious if you think we're seeing the beginning of a major shift in foreign policy in our hemisphere.
Clearly, this administration is seized with the idea of America first, not meaning the United States of America, but meaning the Americas. If we stop and think about it, from Canada to the bottom of Argentina, those are all the Americas. And thus, the Trump administration wants to put a lot of emphasis here. I can understand that impulse, particularly as a former commander of U.S. Southern Command. Here's the problem, Jessica. When you pool these resources and pull them toward this hemisphere, you are giving up influence and engagement against China in the Indo-Pacific, against Russia in the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea. It's a zero-sum game for U.S. military. And my own view is we need to balance our needs here in this hemisphere, which are important, but also against the bigger strategic issues facing China, pushing back on Vladimir Putin, that face us in this 21st century.
And how much of this do you think does relate back to those countries, some of those countries you just named, China, Russia, Iran? Obviously, the charges against Maduro all hinge on these drug charges and go out from there. But there's also the oil piece of this, and there are those other countries that had tried to really put a foothold, and some would argue had put a foothold in Venezuela.
Again, having spent years as commander of Southern Command, all U.S. military operations south of the United States, I watched with great concern the way China continued to intrude in this hemisphere, the way Russia continues to support a rotten regime in Havana. So for the U.S. to take an aggressive stance against those countries here in our homeland, if you will, which in my view stretches from the high north, the Arctic, all the way to Tierra del Fuego in part of Argentina, makes sense. On the other hand, final thought, you've got to face China, not just here in the Americas, but in the Pacific. You have to face Russia on the plains of Ukraine. If you don't, we are going to divide the world into these spheres of influence. That would be ultimately to our detriment.
Venezuela in economic and political freefall. President Trump says the U.S. will be involved in the country's next step, but Venezuela's vice president and acting leader, Delcy Rodríguez, is rejecting any U.S. involvement, instead demanding Maduro and his wife's immediate release. Plus, questions remain about who could possibly take control, rebuild the country's gutted oil infrastructure. Journalist Mary Trini Mina is live in Caracas and has been speaking with locals. Mary, what are you hearing from people today?
Jessica, the most common word that I receive from Venezuelans where they are in shock. This is, we need to put this in context. This is a man that they used to watch on television on a daily basis, bringing long speeches and dancing, and now he is no longer the president. He's a man in custody. So for many Venezuelans, seeing Maduro out of the country and now with a new government in place, it is hard for them to believe that it's going to be a peaceful transition. Some fear that more new events will come in the coming hours inside of Venezuela. The Supreme Court of Venezuela, which is government controlled, designated Delcy Rodríguez, the vice president, as the new interim president of Venezuela. But messages from the government is that they will remain in power.
And Mary, what are Venezuelans telling you about the U.S. potentially being involved in their government's future?
Well, when you ask them about that, despite of what Donald Trump said that they will run the country, when you ask government supporters that demonstrated today, for example, they say that's not a possibility. The message from the loyals of Maduro that still are in charge of the country is that they will not surrender. And some other people that are from the opposition, they prefer not to answer that question because they say they fear for reprisals.
All right, Mary Trina Mina there in Caracas for us. Thank you so much for your reporting, Mary. We appreciate it. I want to go now to CNN's David Culver, who is at a border town in the nation of Colombia, for more on the reaction there. David?
A heavy reinforced military presence on the Colombian side of the Colombia-Venezuela border. And you can see 3 armored vehicles here, a 4th over there. But it's not just military that has set up here on this side of the border, but also we're told humanitarian aid in case anything happens with regards to a rush of individuals coming here into Colombia. Now let me set the stage a bit for you. This is the border crossing where we are, Cúcuta, Colombia. On the other side, you enter Venezuela. And you can see on a Sunday morning, traffic is moving rather calmly back and forth. This is pretty typical if you talk to locals. The only difference is the military presence and the press. And you've got many of individuals from media across Latin America who have set up here to get a sense of what could happen next. Now, Cúcuta is really an interesting town in that this is a pressure valve, if you will, a real indicator of what could come next. This is a place that really saw a lot of the surge of outward migration from Venezuela in the past decade plus. Here in Colombia, you have the largest diaspora of Venezuelans, some 3 million according to some estimates. And of course, you had Venezuelans who passed through here to then continue up into Central America, through Mexico and into the US. Many of them we've met along the way in recent years. And a lot of them reference the instability, the uncertainty, the insecurity of living in Venezuela. So the folks here who have made their lives in Cúcuta, for example, they were out in the streets late into the night. In fact, we touched down just before midnight, and folks were still out celebrating. You had families draping themselves in flags. There were a lot of emotions. People seemingly very happy. What's interesting is when you speak to those individuals, those who have been, say, 10 plus years out of Venezuela, say they have their lives here in Colombia. No matter what changes in Venezuela, they have no real desire to move back. But those who have been here less than that, and it seems to be a rough average of 10 years or so, say they do want to go home. They want to try to reestablish their lives. So this could be a place where we see a few things. You could see folks who are fearing the chaos, fearing more instability, fearing more fracturing coming from Venezuela into Colombia.
Captured Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, they are now here in New York, where they're facing a number of serious criminal charges, according to their federal indictment. CNN's Stefano Pozzebon, who's covered this from the start, looks back at Maduro's rise to power and the moments that led to his downfall Saturday.
In the end, it was clashes with the U.S. which set Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro's political rule in flames. Sources telling CNN he was dragged from his bedroom by U.S. forces after a barrage of strikes on Saturday, his vice president quickly sounding the alarm regarding his safety.
We do not know the whereabouts of President Nicolás Maduro and First Lady Cilia Flores. We demand immediate proof of life from the government of President Donald Trump, proof of life for President Maduro and the First Lady.
While the scale of the strikes may have come as a surprise, tensions between Venezuela's leader and the United States have been ratcheting up for months. Less than 4 weeks ago, the U.S. Treasury slapping sanctions of 3 members of Maduro's family, 2 of whom were dubbed the narco-nephews from previous drug trafficking convictions. Maduro and his lawyer wife, Cilia Flores, both cut their teeth during the rule of Hugo Chavez, a socialist revolutionary who served as Venezuela's president from 1999 to 2013. While Flores served as the country's attorney general, it was in Chavez's government that Maduro got his big break as foreign minister, spearheading anti-American policies and bolstering ties to China, Russia and Iran from 2006 to 2013. After Chavez's death from cancer in 2013, it wasn't long before Maduro stepped into the top job, narrowly beating opposition leader Enrique Capriles in a spring election, the first of many to raise questions of fairness. A loyal disciple of Chavez's socialist ideals, in 2014 Maduro shared his commitment to keeping his legacy alive with CNN's Cristiana Mampour.
I know I've been loyal, and I'm fulfilling the legacy of this marvelous giant figure who is President Chavez, and it gives me peace of mind.
These ideals didn't help him much in steering Venezuela's economy through challenges like plunging oil prices, however. In fact, his failure to manage the country's oil wealth triggered an unprecedented economic collapse. Intense food shortages soon spawned the term the Maduro diet, a reference to the involuntary weight loss and malnutrition endured by regular Venezuelans. By the time the public took the ballot boxes in 2024, the anger could be felt from all sides. Despite both Maduro and the opposition party claiming victory, the president managed to salsa his way through the political storm and remain in office. But in September, the US began striking alleged drug trafficking vessels in the Caribbean Sea as President Trump doubled down on his crackdown on narcotics smuggling. And while Maduro told CNN in December he was focused on a message of peace,
To unite for the peace of the continent. No more endless wars, no more unjust wars.
that call has fallen on deaf ears.
The Trump administration has posted video of what it calls Nicolás Maduro's perp walk. You see him here. You see the ousted Venezuelan president being escorted, his hands in handcuffs, inside the Drug Enforcement Administration headquarters in New York City. Maduro was processed and fingerprinted there. He's now set to face drugs and weapon charges in Manhattan at federal court. That possibly could happen next week. U.S. extraction teams, they captured Maduro and his wife in a major military operation overnight Saturday. President Donald Trump says that the U.S. will now run Venezuela.
Do you envision the U.S. military having a presence in Venezuela as the U.S. runs that country?
No, we're going to have a presence in Venezuela as it pertains to oil, because we have to have, we're sending our expertise in. So you may need something, not very much. But no, we're going to be taking out a tremendous amount of wealth out of the ground. And that wealth is going to the people of Venezuela and people from outside of Venezuela that used to be in Venezuela. And it goes also to the United States of America in the form of reimbursement for the damages caused us by that country.
And hours after the U.S. military deposed Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, Donald Trump was laying out his plan for that country's vast oil reserves. The president says that his administration will partner with U.S. energy companies to take control of Venezuela's oil infrastructure. It's estimated that Venezuela is sitting on a fifth of the world's reserve of crude oil, and unlocking it could massively benefit U.S. industries. Donald Trump also claims the U.S. is owed some of its wealth. For more on Venezuela's vast oil reserves, I'm joined now by energy expert Cornelia Meyer, the CEO of Meyer Resources. She's also chairman and chief economist at LBV Asset Management. It's good to see you.
Good morning, Paulo.
Yeah, good morning to you in Switzerland. So the reserves are vast in Venezuela, but just how much of global oil production is Venezuela responsible for?
Well, at this point, very little. It is about 934,000 barrels a day, which is less than 1% of global production. Venezuela used to produce in the heyday more than 3 million barrels a day, so that production came off due to mismanagement under Chavez and Maduro by about 70%. So very little. So whatever happens, it will not immediately have a big impact on oil prices. you saw, they were actually falling. And mind you, it's great if U.S. companies are going in, but this is not a light switch. Restarting, reigniting the upstream production does take time. Few 100,000 barrels maybe over the first 6 months or so. So it's not as easy as it looks. One more thing, Chevron is operating currently in Venezuela, is exempt from sanctions because under a production sharing agreement, they're not paying the regime dollars, they're paying them in barrels.
And so you mentioned the complicated nature that is more than just a flip of a switch. But what about companies like Chevron? I mean, would they go in if there are no guarantees for their assets, security guarantees for their assets? I mean, would they go in a volatile area?
Well, Chevron is in. So for Chevron, they know how to handle it. But it's a very good question because what you see with U.S. companies, they tend to be a little bit more jittery in going in U.S. and European companies when there is too much political instability, too much volatility. We saw that, for instance, in Iraq. It was Chinese companies, Russian companies that initially went in. It was not U.S. companies and Western companies. They then followed as the situation got better. And that brings me to the next point. This is not just about oil. It's also about rare earths and Chinese control of mining operations in Venezuela, which then makes what happened compatible with the new U.S. security strategy.
Cornelia, there are drivers in the U.S. and around the world that are watching. I'll ask a question that's probably heavy on their minds. How could this jolt to Venezuela's government impact oil markets and specifically gas prices?
Well, I think it is at this point, as I said, not impacting oil markets because it's localized. It's less than 1% of global production, so it doesn't really in an oil market that is sort of oversupplied. By some people, OPEC says just well supplied. Other people, like the IEA, say oversupplied to the tune of 2 million barrels a day. It doesn't really make that much of a difference. But what we have to look at is again the stability, because this is Latin America has actually become very important for incremental new oil production. When we look at the new oil production, non-OPEC oil production coming on stream comes from the US, it comes from Brazil, it comes from Guyana, and it comes from Argentina.
Finally, Cornelia, can you help me fact check President Trump's claim that, and you may have just heard it right now, that the U.S. is owed some of Venezuelans' oil wealth? I mean, what is true about that?
Well, there was a nationalization spree in the 1970s, and then again, when Hugo Chavez came in, he sort of nationalized some more. So if you look at that as appropriating what was owned by the U.S., you can go there, but then you can also say, what were the precise ownership agreements? Were they production sharing agreements? Were they concessions? What was it? But certainly there has been nationalization twice in Venezuela.
Really, now, in terms of what you'll be watching closely, especially as we wait to see what the next chapter for Venezuela will be, I mean, what do you think may be an outcome, particularly for the people of Venezuela? I mean, there was one Venezuelan migrant who fled that country and said that their oil was, in her words, it was stolen 25 years ago. So what do you think may be the best outcome for the people who stayed behind?
Well, the best outcome, the most important outcome is stability. We've seen in other places when foreign countries sort of go and take over that chaos and instability ensued, and that's not good. So stability and security for the population is the most important thing. Secondly, if they're no longer under sanctions, that, economic activity can resume because, Venezuelans were suffering. The 30 million that stayed, 8 million left. The 30 million that stayed, they had hyperinflation. There's so many people sunk below the poverty line. It was really quite difficult. So the best thing for the people of Venezuela would be economic and political stability.
If Trump's tariffs from last year have taught us anything, is that economic stability, the stability in the markets, that translates to stability for the population and consumers. Cornelia Meyer, as always, thank you so much for letting us tap into your expertise this morning.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's our pleasure. In the wake of Saturday's American military operation to capture Maduro, congressional leaders, they are calling for a briefing on the operation. A House Armed Services Committee aide tells CNN that a panel is set to potentially hold one of these briefings next week. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio attempted to defend the administration's decision not to notify or seek approval from Congress.
We called members of Congress immediately after. This was not the kind of mission that you can do congressional notification on. It was a trigger-based mission in which conditions had to be met night after night. We watched and monitored that for a number of days. So it's just simply not the kind of mission you can call people and say, hey, we may do this at some point in the next 15 days.
Months in the making and just a few hours that it took to execute. That's just how the U.S. military is describing the operation to capture Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. The top U.S. general discussed those details on Saturday. Listen to this.
This operation, known as Operation Absolute Resolve, was discreet, precise, and conducted during the darkest hours of January 2nd and was the culmination of months of planning and rehearsal. It required the utmost of precision and integration within our joint force. And the word integration does not explain the sheer complexity of such a mission. An extraction so precise, it involved more than 150 aircraft launching across the Western Hemisphere in close coordination, all coming together in time and place to layer effects for a single purpose: to get an interdiction force into downtown Caracas while maintaining the element of tactical surprise. After months of work by our intelligence teammates to find Maduro and understand how he moved, where he lived, where he traveled, what he ate, what he wore, what were his pets, in early December, our force was set pending a series of aligned events. Key was choosing the right day to minimize the potential for civilian harm and maximize the element of surprise and minimize the harm to the indicted personnel so, as the president said, they could be brought to justice. Over the course of the night, aircraft began launching from 20 different bases on land and sea across the Western Hemisphere. In total, more than 150 aircraft, bombers, fighters, intelligence, reconnaissance, surveillance, rotary wing were in the air last night. Thousands and thousands of hours of experience were airborne. Our youngest crew member was 20, and our oldest crew member was 49, and there's simply no match for American military might. As the night began, the helicopters took off with the extraction force, which included law enforcement officers, and began their flight into Venezuela at 100 feet above the water. As they approached Venezuelan shores, the United States began layering different effects provided by Spacecom, Cybercom, and other members of the interagency to create a pathway. As the force crossed the last point of high terrain where they'd been hiding in the clutter, we assessed that we had maintained totally the element of surprise. As the helicopter force ingressed towards the objective at low level, we arrived at Maduro's compound at 1:01 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, or 2:01 a.m. Caracas local time, and the apprehension force descended into Maduro's compound and moved with speed, precision, and discipline towards their objective and isolated the area to ensure the safety and security of the ground force while apprehending the indicted persons. As the operation unfolded at the compound, our air and ground intelligence teams provided real-time updates to the ground force, ensuring those forces could safely navigate the complex environment without unnecessary risk. The force remained protected by overhead tactical aviation. Maduro and his wife, both indicted, gave up and were taken into custody by the Department of Justice, assisted by our incredible U.S. military with professionalism and precision, with no loss of U.S. life.
Let's now get you some of the reaction from world leaders as they respond to President Trump's military action in Venezuela. Meanwhile, we're also hearing from Venezuelans living in other parts of the world that are celebrating the operation. Here's a look. World leaders are swiftly reacting to the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer making it clear the UK had no part in it.
I can be absolutely clear that we were not involved in that. And as you know, I always say and believe we should all uphold international law.
But there is outrage among many Latin American leaders. Brazilian President Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva said the U.S. attack, quote, crossed an unacceptable line and was a serious affront to Venezuela's sovereignty. Condemnation also coming from the leaders of Colombia, Chile, Cuba, and Mexico. But Argentina's president, a Trump ally, appearing to welcome the capture of the Venezuelan leader, posting on social media that freedom advances. But the developments are being closely tracked around the world.
In today's times, such massive events as today's attacks by American forces have an impact on the entire world. So we shall be responding and preparing ourselves for this new situation.
Russia, a close ally of Venezuela, called the U.S. strikes an act of armed aggression. And China, whose envoy had met with Maduro just hours before his capture, says the U.S. violated international law. But apart from the sharp diplomatic fallout, reaction in many places where Venezuelans are living abroad has been jubilant. Libertad! Libertad! In Madrid, which is one of the largest populations of Venezuelan expats outside of Latin America and the U.S., many people waved Venezuelan flags and cheered Maduro's downfall. And in Florida, some people expressing relief that Maduro was in U.S. custody, saying it may make it possible for them to return home one day.
My reaction is I'm so happy because now Venezuela is free.
These are some of the passionate protests on the doorstep of the White House on Saturday. And all of this as some Americans voice their frustration with the prospect of war and bloodshed over oil. In New York, where Maduro is now being held, more demonstrators carrying the message, no war on Venezuela. They were on the streets just hours after President Trump announced the capture of Maduro and his wife. Other protests, they have been reported in cities including Boston, Minneapolis, and in Atlanta. Continue to follow breaking news here on CNN. The U.S. Secretary of Transportation, Sean Duffy, says that flights over the Caribbean, that they have now resumed. Earlier, he posted on social media that restrictions expired at midnight Eastern Time. He tells stranded travelers to continue to work with their airlines. And all this comes after hundreds of flights were canceled or delayed due to the U.S. strikes on Venezuela and that operation. JetBlue, it was perhaps the most affected, according to the tracking site FlightAware. It canceled 209 flights and delayed another 263 by Saturday afternoon. The airline says that flights to the Dominican Republic and Jamaica, those are unaffected. United Airlines, it is telling passengers that they can rebook for free. And now that Maduro is out of the country, some of his paramilitary groups, they are showing that they are very much still in the picture. On Saturday, a CNN crew spotted civilians armed with assault rifles who belong to pro-government armed groups. They control certain parts of Caracas and played a major role in keeping Maduro in power before his capture. And they also often functioned as law enforcement in some of the more impoverished areas in the country, but the opposition calls them organized crime. They exist even though Venezuela's law bans anyone outside of police and military from carrying weapons. Yet there they are.
Breaking news this hour. Ousted Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife are now in U.S. custody. And he arrived at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn on Saturday night. You can see this. He's set to face drug and weapons charges in New York in the coming days. Maduro and his wife were captured during a large-scale U.S. military operation early on Saturday morning. U.S. President Donald Trump told reporters that the military could have killed Maduro. This is what he said. Have a listen.
He was trying to get into a safe place. You know what a safe place is, all steel. And he wasn't able to make it to the door because our guys were so fast. They went through the opposition so fast. There was a lot of gunfire. You saw some of it today. But he was trying to get to his safe place, which wasn't safe because we would have had the door blown up in about 47 seconds, they say on average, regardless of how thick the steel was. It was a very thick door. It was a very heavy door, but he was unable to get to that door. He made it to the door. He was unable to close it.
Venezuelan Vice President Delcy Rodríguez has now been declared the acting president. But President Trump says the U.S. will run Venezuela and take control of its massive oil reserves. Our Evan Perez filed this report from outside the detention center where Maduro is being held in New York.
Nicolás Maduro and his wife Cilia are now in the Metropolitan Detention Center here in Brooklyn, capping an extraordinary 20 hours or so after they were snatched from their bedroom in Caracas. They were transported to a U.S. military ship off the coast of Venezuela, the Iwo Jima, and then to Guantanamo Bay, where they were put on a plane to New York. Now, that began the process while they were under arrest to face 4 sets of charges from the Justice Department. Those include narco-terrorism and cocaine importation conspiracy. A number of other Venezuelan officials are also named in this indictment that was unsealed by the Justice Department earlier on Saturday. Now, this begins an extraordinary process for the U.S. government. They have the former Venezuelan leader here now in Brooklyn, and it'll probably be a few months of court battles over the legitimacy of these charges. Now, earlier today, there were hundreds of people from the Venezuelan community who turned up outside the Metropolitan Detention Center to cheer on the arrest of the former Venezuelan leader. Even late into the evening, there were several dozen that remained outside the facility. Depending on where Maduro is being held, he might actually be able to hear some of those cheers. Now, we expect that Maduro will next appear in public in federal court in Manhattan to face these charges as soon as Monday. Evan Perez, Brooklyn, New York.
CNN Chief Law Enforcement and Intelligence Analyst John Miller walks us through what Maduro, as well as his wife, could expect during their first couple of days in U.S. detention and what the legal process could look like for the former president and First Lady of Venezuela.
He will be held in one of the men's sections. His wife will be held in one of the women's sections. And they will likely be held in isolation for that first day. These are high-profile prisoners. They are high-security prisoners. So they will likely be held by themselves, alone in a cell, without a cellmate, probably under watch of the Bureau of Prisons constantly. At the arraignment, their lawyers will have the chance to discuss with the judge or the magistrate what their conditions will be for being held. Bail is very unlikely to be an issue here in that there is no judge in the Southern District who's going to grant bail to someone who's charged with being behind this many resources or this high-risk a defendant, or for that matter, his wife. But they may argue that they want him in general population. And then he may be mixing with the likes of P. Diddy and Luigi Mangione. But at least for the first day, it is entirely probable that they will be by themselves, but separate.
Well, as we mentioned, Vice President Delcy Rodríguez has now been declared Venezuela's acting president. Here's what President Trump had to say about the U.S. role in Venezuela's transition of power.
We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. We're there now, but we're going to stay until such time as the proper transition can take place. So we're going to stay until such time as we're going to run it, essentially, until such time as a proper transition can take place.
Well, Mr. Trump has ruled out Venezuelan opposition leader and this year's Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Corina Machado as having a role in the post-Maduro government.
I think it would be very tough for her to be the leader. She doesn't have the support within, or the respect within the country. She's a very nice woman, but she doesn't have the respect to be the leader.
Let's get more on all of this. Fred Plykin joins me now. And Fred, we'll talk about Maria Corina Machado in just a moment, because that took many people by surprise, of course. Let me start with what we heard from the US president in that lengthy press conference. And some of the statements were quite striking from the US. First saying that he will run the country, will run it until a safe, proper and judicious transition. What does that actually mean? We will run it. I mean, are they running the judiciary? Are they running the armed forces? Do we know?
Does it mean boots on the ground? Does it mean American personnel on the ground? Does it mean administrative personnel on the ground? There really is no clue at this point in time what exactly the president meant. And there's certainly several things to unpack there, I think. First of all, from the president's statements, he said safe, proper, and judicious. What he didn't say was democratic.
Correct.
He didn't say that there was going to be elections. Of course, there are some who say that Corina Machado was elected president. You know, the election was essentially stolen from her. And he's giving her the cold shoulder. It's been quite interesting. One of the things that I've been tracking overnight was there was an interview with Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense with CBS, where he was asked, what exactly does that mean? You guys are going to be running the country. And he really wouldn't give a direct answer to that. He said, look, the president has options. The president is flipping the switch. The president has several things at his disposal. They didn't say whether or not there was going to be... No details. Also, whether or not there was going to be a large American force on the ground, whether or not any other American personnel would be on the ground, who would obviously have to be secured as well. And what we've been seeing since Maduro was ousted or taken from power is that his power center still does seem to have control on the ground. We've seen those Chavistas on the ground with weapons controlling people in the streets of Caracas. We have seen the defense minister in the streets of Caracas. So clearly, the power center that was there before is still there and is still essentially running the country. And if we look at some of the other things that President Trump said, for instance, about Delcy Rodríguez, who is now in power, he has said that they're in contact with her already as well. So it's unclear what they meant. What he does seem to mean, though, is that in some way, shape, or form, and this is something that President Trump said, they are going to want to control the oil industry. They're willing to put troops on the ground to secure the
And Delcy is a person for it because she is seen in the eyes of the United States more moderate. Of course, she is a Chavista and a very strong ally, of course, of Maduro, but she's also oil minister. So she's the one that always is the one that is seeing Minister of Petroleum since 2024. She is the one that often sees a lot of international faces, so the face of Venezuela, so she will know exactly how to handle, in many ways, probably not just Secretary Rubio, but also President Trump. I thought it was interesting what you said. There was no democratic, right? Not calling for democracy. In fact, the word democracy did not appear once in President Trump's speech yesterday and statement to the press. So the question then goes, if we look at the current structure that we have, we've got Delcy Rodríguez as vice president, we have Pedrino, who's a defense minister, and we have Diosdado Cabello, who is the interior minister. Those two guys are like the henchmen of Nicolás Maduro. They always work behind the shadows. They've got their hands, they're so bloody, their hands. How can the United States, I mean, first of all, does the United States believe, you think, they've got control over them? And do you think they will act? Because yesterday, you heard Delcy Rodríguez saying, we're not going to be a colony. We're not going to be colonized. Is this just lip service?
I think that was one of the most interesting statements that we heard. Where on the one hand, we had President Trump at his press conference saying, look, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, has already been in touch with Delcy Rodríguez. She's going to be accommodating. And then you had her come out and said, we're not going to be a colony. We demand that Nicolás Maduro be returned. He's still a legitimate president of Venezuela. Those were all very interesting statements. Now, is that just lip service from her? And on the sidelines, is she saying, look, we are going to work with the United States, especially when it comes to the oil? But I think what you're saying about the defense minister and the interior minister, one of the other things is that the interior minister apparently is in one of the indictments that Maduro is in as well for drug trafficking. And on the face of it, and this was the original reason why President Trump said he was putting all this pressure on the Maduro regime and on Venezuela, was drug trafficking. Bombing those drug boats, bombing targets on land. And now all of a sudden, it's unclear whether or not the U.S. is going to leave these people in power and to run the place. And of course, any sort of transition to a different system in Venezuela most probably could not happen with the current leadership in power.
Look, we mentioned just before we came to Maria Corina Machado, to many people, she's been completely forgotten about by this administration, or at least that seems to be the case so far. I spoke to her last year. Have a listen to what she said to me. We've been here before. I mean, you think this time will be different? What are you hearing from those around Maduro, around that power structure?
I believe this is a unique moment for many reasons. First of all, it's not the same regime. The regime is, as I say, weaker. It is evident that there have been many defections. We wouldn't have been able to collect over 85% of the tally sheets that proved our victory, if it wasn't for the cooperation of the military that disobeyed the orders not to give them to us. So this is a very different regime, and also, and most importantly, our country, our society. I mean, if we had had a minimum competitive conditions, we would have won by a 90-10 margin. So this is huge, what is happening. I mean, Venezuela coming together, understanding that this is a unique opportunity and that we're not going to let it go.
I mean, Nobel Peace Prize winner dedicated a Nobel Peace Prize to President Trump. President Trump saying yesterday she's a very nice woman, but lacks the support and respect in the country. It will be very difficult for her to run it. Help us make sense of this, Fred.
Well, I think there's probably two things at play there. On the one hand, she certainly appears to have the political support in the country. And she's probably right that if there was a free and fair election where all competitive things were on the same level, she would probably win by a landslide. But then, of course, the United States probably right now is also looking at what would it take to dismantle the current power structure? What would that mean for Venezuela? Also, what would that mean in terms of some of the armed groups that are on the ground in Venezuela as well? Because we have to keep in mind that especially over the past couple of months, as the pressure from the United States has been mounting, Maduro has been relying more and more, for instance, on the Chavistas on the ground to keep him in power. And even now, we're hearing from people on the ground that people are not going out, even those who do want to celebrate all of this, because they are scared that the current power structure is still in place. So is the Trump administration shying away from possible nation building? One of those key words that obviously we've had in the past to try and get this done as fast as possible. I think there's also domestic concerns in the United States as well. Because one thing that we have to keep in mind is that there are also a lot of conservative Trump supporters who feel that this has gone too far, who are still very much hurt and pained by what happened in Iraq and the aftermath of that, and are saying, look, we don't really need any foreign adventures.
Iraq and Afghanistan, really all cautionary tales. Thank you very much, Fred Bleiken. We'll stay and talk to Fred the next hour or so. And still to come right here on the show. Venezuelans here in their capital, that is Caracas, protesting the U.S. capture of their leader, Nicolás Maduro. Some of them are reacting to President Trump's statement that the U.S. would be running Venezuela.
What does he mean by that? Well, I don't know what he means. What kind of control will he have? How will he have control? Where are the people who are going to control that? I think we're all in the same position, waiting to find out what the truth is.
Honestly, no. Honestly, no. I don't know what power he has to take control of Venezuela, of Venezuelans, but we're waiting to see what's going to happen regarding that. But I don't agree with another president, someone from outside of Venezuela, taking control of us Venezuelans.
Elsewhere, there was celebration over President Maduro's capture. You see there, Madrid. I'll have more on how the Venezuelan diaspora is reacting a little later in the program this hour. While Donald Trump is putting his Colombian counterpart on notice, crudely telling him to watch his backside. Trump noted that Colombia produces cocaine and sends it to the U.S., apparently implying Colombia could be next. The president spoke after President Gustavo Petro said he was not concerned about possible fallout from Maduro's capture. Well, I interviewed the Colombian leader a few weeks ago about what Trump really wants in Venezuela, and as you're about to see, he didn't mince his words. We know President Trump is transactional. You're saying he's going after Venezuela's oil. If that is the case, do you think the United States will attack, will strike inside of Venezuela?
Oh, they're going to get the oil for next to nothing. Because that's what the anecdotal evidence suggests. Trump isn't negotiating with Maduro on drug issues because he's not a fool. You only have to look at the figures. Only about 4% of Colombia's drug production, cocaine production, because we don't produce much else, goes through Venezuela. Just the margin, yes. Most of it is going out through the Pacific Ocean, most of it. So negotiations over oil? I think that's Trump's logic. He's not thinking about the democratization of Venezuela, let alone drug trafficking.
President Petro speaking to me in November. Well, my next guest is an American citizen who was held hostage by Nicolás Maduro for 5 years. His book, 1,775 Days in Captivity, describes what he went through during that time. Jorge Toledo was a member of the so-called Citgo 6 petroleum executives whom the U.S. considered wrongfully detained. He joins me now live from Austin in Texas. Jorge, wonderful to see you again. It's been a while since you and I spoke. You were released, of course, from captivity. Indeed. You were there for many, many days, that we just told 1,775 days to be exact. Can I just first, Jorge, get your reaction to those images of seeing Maduro captured and in handcuffs in the U.S.? What does this mean to you, Jorge?
Well, it's a couple of things came into my mind. The first one is, the cause and effect. So this individual caused a lot of suffering to an entire country and citizens from other places like myself. But in the other side, I recall my first day in prison and how I felt. And I thought, now you're on the other side of the fence. So now you know how it feels to be, in that situation. So, but in summary, for me, it's cause and effect.
And Jorge, viewers might not know this. You were held in the notorious helicoid prison. You face physical, you face psychological torture. This is something you write about in your book. Speak, first of all, to what you went through, because this tells us what the Maduro regime is really capable of, right? I know the regime has committed many atrocities, even facing accusations of crime against humanity. Speak to what you went through and some of your colleagues of Citgo 6.
Well, as you said, and as I wrote, I documented in my book, I went through a physical and psychological torture in not only at El Helicoide, also in a DGCIM, which is the maximum security military prison that I spent 50% of my time. Honestly, I never thought that kind of evil exists in humankind. Something that I noticed also was the influence of Cubans, Iranians, and their methodologies of torture. This is something that was openly discussed within the prison, not only within the prisoners, also the guards mentioned this. So I am very concerned, by the way, for the whereabouts of the political prisoners, people that I met in prison that are still in prison in Venezuela because of the risk of retaliation. So their life is in jeopardy.
Yeah, there's a huge concern and so many questions right now about what this current structure that is in place in Venezuela, because while Maduro, Jorge, is out, those who operate in the shadows, and you know them well, Diosdado Cabello, Vladimir Padrino, the Interior and Defense Minister, they're still in power. Do you believe that this is the end of Chavismo? Because President Trump says they're going to run the country. Do you believe that Delcy Rodríguez, her brother, and the others have handed over the controls, you think, to President Trump?
Well, I think that if they want to implement democracy in the country, they need to, remove not only Maduro, also his entourage. So, because we're not talking about a government or ideology, we're talking about a bunch of criminals abducting an entire country. So. It's Maduro is the head, but there's an architecture that was built during the past more than 26 or 30 years ago. So it's complex. But I'm sure that what I have my lecture on President Trump's words is he discloses very few information. But it's obvious that they have a plan on what is next, and they are executing that plan.
Well, let's hope they do. But you're right about the structure. It's a whole criminal enterprise, that's for sure. And while I have you here, because we are running out of time, Jorge, you were a former Citgo, a petroleum executive. When the president, and we heard them say this yesterday, when the president says, Jorge, that the US will take control of Venezuela's oil reserves, what do you make that to mean? I mean, there are plenty of questions, first of all, and we won't get into this with you. It's not area of expertise about the legality of this. But from an industry perspective, speak to how challenging that might be, because under Maduro and Chavez, the whole infrastructure has been completely mismanaged and ruined.
Well, it's again, there's a very little information on a huge and complex issue. So you have inactive oil wells that need to be restarted, and sometimes to restart an oil well is more expensive than drill a new one. So this takes time. The value chain of the oil business is extensive. So you have oil production, you also have the refineries. So, but I think the point is the Venezuelan crude oil hasn't been present in the United States since before I was detained in Venezuela. So the other barrels replaced the Venezuelan barrels in the Gulf Coast. The Venezuelan barrels were going mainly to China, to Pacific at very high discounts. So I think what the short-term strategy from the U.S. government would be, blocking that oil flow that goes to China. So that is, I think, more geopolitical perspective on the value chain of the oil business.
Jorge, really appreciate you being with us.
President Trump's order for U.S. forces to capture Nicolás Maduro was the culmination of a months-long pressure campaign on Venezuela and is really one of the most consequential moments of either of his two presidencies. Now, when we were over at Mar-a-Lago on Saturday for the president's press conference, it was striking how much detail was revealed about what went into the planning for this operation. Months and months of CIA work on the ground in Caracas to track Maduro's locations, to track his rhythms, to ensure that this raid went off seamlessly, sort of a minute-by-minute accounting of the raid as it was happening on the ground there in Venezuela, and then a description of how the forces found Maduro in his home and captured him as he was fleeing to his safe room. So a lot of details there. What we did not hear much from the president on is what he envisions happening next. When he says that the U.S. will, quote, run Venezuela going forward, the president offering not a lot of detail about what precisely he has in mind for what amounts to a temporary protectorate in a country of 30 million people. That's 1.5 times the size of Texas, and where the U.S. has no official presence. The U.S. hasn't had an open embassy in Venezuela since 2019. The president was pressed again and again by reporters about what exactly he was envisioning happening on the ground there. Listen to what he said.
Well, they always say boots on the ground. So we're not afraid of boots on the ground if we have to have. We had boots on the ground last night at a very high level, actually. We're not afraid of it. We don't mind saying it.
President, can you explain the exact mechanism by which you're going to run the country? Are you going to designate a U.S. official to coordinate?
Yes, it's all being done right now. We're designating people. We're talking to people. We're designating various people. It's largely going to be, for a period of time, the people that are standing right behind me. We're going to be running it. We're going to be bringing it back.
Now, I also pressed the president about what he thinks about a prolonged American military presence on the ground in Venezuela, and he didn't answer that explicitly. He said he wasn't afraid of boots on the ground, but when I asked whether that meant sort of a prolonged presence for U.S. forces, he pivoted almost immediately to discussing Venezuela's oil. That has been a preoccupation of the president's for quite some time. Venezuela, of course, sitting on the world's largest proven oil reserves. And And so I think, taken all together, certainly a dramatic day, a successful raid militarily by the U.S., but one that raises a whole host of questions that the president didn't necessarily have answers for, at least on Saturday. Kevin Liptak, CNN, West Palm Beach, Florida.
Well, some U.S. lawmakers are demanding to know why they were notified prior to the Maduro operation. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Donald Trump weighed in, the president blaming Congress for being untrustworthy.
It's just not the kind of mission that you can pre-notify because it endangers the mission.
Mr. President, one of the only people who watched this live.
Congress has a tendency to leak. This would not be good. If they leaked, General, I think it would have been maybe a very different result. But I have to say, they knew we were coming at some point, you know. A lot of ships out there, they sort of knew.
Mr. President,
Congress will leak, and we don't want to leak.
Mr. President.
Well, earlier, CNN's Erica Hill asked Democratic Congressman Jill Soneras about the president's allegation.
Congress is not the problem. The House Armed Services problem is not the problem with leaks. Their own Secretary of Defense in the Trump administration is the one who has leaked information out to the public, who is told about operations that had happened in the past. That's where the leaks come from. They have a responsibility to notify Congress what is going to happen. And pretty much the Secretary of State lied to the House of Representatives when he came and told us that they would not seek military action without the approval of Congress. And that's exactly what they did.
Nicolás Maduro and his wife are being held in detention. U.S. Drug Enforcement agents, they transferred the couple to the U.S. after being captured in a large-scale U.S. military operation. He arrived at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn Saturday night. He's set to face drugs and weapons charges in New York in the coming days. President Trump told reporters that troops could have killed Maduro during the operation.
He was trying to get into a safe place. You know, the safe place is all steel. And he wasn't able to make it to the door because our guys were so fast. They went through the opposition so fast. There was a lot of gunfire. You saw some of it today. But he was trying to get to a safe place, which wasn't safe because we would have had the door blown up in about 47 seconds, they say on average, regardless of how thick the steel was. It was a very thick door. It was a very heavy door, but he was unable to get to that door. He made it to the door. He was unable to close it.
The White House also released these photos showing President Trump and members of his national security team watching the operation as it played out early Saturday. He says that the U.S. will, quote, run the country for now and take control of Venezuela's massive oil reserves. Well, more on that a little later in the broadcast. The president also said that he could put troops on the ground to help secure said oil. Venezuela's Supreme Court ordered Vice President Delcy Rodríguez to assume the duties of acting president in Venezuela after Maduro was captured. She's calling on the U.S. to release Maduro and his wife.
We demand the immediate release of President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, the only president of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
President Trump said at a news conference that Secretary of State Marco Rubio spoke with Rodríguez and added that she said, quote, we're going to do whatever you need. CNN's Evan Perez filed this report from outside the detention center where Maduro is currently being held.
Nicolás Maduro and his wife Cilia are now in the Metropolitan Detention Center here in Brooklyn, capping an extraordinary 20 hours or so after they were snatched from their bedroom in Caracas. They were transported to a U.S. military ship off the coast of Venezuela, the Iwo Jima, and then to Guantanamo Bay, where they were put on a plane to New York. Now, that began the process while they were under arrest to face 4 sets of charges from the Justice Department. Those include narco-terrorism and cocaine importation conspiracy. A number of other Venezuelan officials are also named in this indictment that was unsealed by the Justice Department earlier on Saturday. Now, this begins an extraordinary process for the U.S. government. They have the former Venezuelan leader here now in Brooklyn, and it'll probably be a few months of of court battles over the legitimacy of these charges. Now, earlier today, there were hundreds of people from the Venezuelan community who turned up outside the Metropolitan Detention Center to cheer on the arrest of the former Venezuelan leader. Even late into the evening, there were several dozen that remained outside the facility. Depending on where Maduro is being held, he might actually be able to hear some of those cheers. Now, we expect that Maduro will next appear in public in federal court in Manhattan to face these charges as soon as Monday. Evan Perez, Brooklyn, New York.
As we mentioned, Vice President Delcy Rodríguez has now been declared Venezuela's acting president. U.S. President Donald Trump announced on Saturday that she was being sworn in. One Caracas resident told CNN Rodríguez is, quote, a terrifying figure of the government in charge of the most oppressive tactics used against Venezuela's citizens. Here's what President Trump had to say about the U.S.'s role in Venezuela's transition to power.
We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. So we don't want to be involved with having somebody else get in, and we have the same situation that we had for the last long period of years. So we are going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. And it has to be judicious, because that's what we're all about.
CNN's Julia Benbrook has more from Washington now.
There are still a lot of questions here, but I want to take a step back and look at what we have heard from the White House directly. Following reports of explosions in Venezuela, President Donald Trump took to social media, his True Social platform, to confirm the United States was behind this large-scale attack against Venezuela and its leader, Nicolás Maduro. He also, at that time, made the stunning reveal that Maduro and his wife had been captured and removed from the country. Trump can be seen in photos released by the White House watching this complex operation take place. He monitored this from his Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida. That's where he's been spending the holiday. That's also where he spoke with reporters about this. He praised the operation, saying that it was one of the most stunning, effective, and powerful displays of American military might and competence in American history. Now, he also said that the United States would, quote, run the country until a judicious transition can happen. Trump has not ruled out boots on the ground, saying that he is not afraid of it if he believes that it's necessary. During that press conference, he was pressed on if he had spoken with Venezuela's opposition leader and the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Maria Corina Machado. He was also pressed in a follow-up question about her potential ability to lead. I want you to listen to some of that back and forth.
Yes.
Is the U.S. aware of the location of opposition leader Machado, and have you been in contact with her?
No, we haven't. No, we haven't. Oh, I think it would be very tough for her to be the leader. She doesn't have the support within, or the respect within the country. She's a very nice woman, but she doesn't have the respect to be the leader.
Now, Trump has said that the United States is working with Venezuela's Vice President Delcy Rodríguez, but she has demanded Maduro's immediate release and has insisted he is the country's legitimate leader. Julia Benbrook, CNN, Washington.
Let's go now to CNN Senior National Security Analyst Juliette Kayyem. Juliette, thank you so much for taking some time to join us after what's been just an incredible 24 hours. I know you've been following closely.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course, it's our pleasure. So the Trump administration seems to frame this detention of a head of state on foreign soil as a law enforcement operation targeting an indicted individual. In your opinion, do you think that that gave the administration more room to operate? Or do you think that the operation may have been on shaky legal ground?
So I think that we need to at least now, 20 hours later, sort of separate the precision of the capture, which I think was precise, was successful, with what we're now seeing, which is, I think, the vagaries of the justification or any plans on day 2. We've spent, as you're reporting and the lead up of our reporters just show, a lot of time trying to assess what was the purpose of this capture, because the president went from everything from leadership change to regime change to oil to this law enforcement effort that you discuss. On the legal front, of course, there is an indictment against Maduro. The indictment does not discuss the things that President Trump seems to be focused on, which is, of course, fentanyl. But most legal analysts in international law are unanimous in saying that this is not justified under international law, that the mere disagreement with a foreign leader does not justify this kind of arrest and, of course, capture, of which the Venezuelans are calling essentially an abduction or hostage taking.
And in listening to President Trump on Saturday afternoon, Juliet, it didn't seem that there was a real plan in place. I thought that there was really some substance that was missing there. So considering that, what questions would you pose to the Trump administration about just how it went about in detaining Maduro and what it sees as Venezuela's future?
Yeah, I think that's just an important distinction. We tend to get focused, at least in the news, on the sort of power and shock and awe of the military action. You can applaud that and say that was a good capture, and but then question what now. I think the president was exceptionally confusing. I'll just be honest with you. If you're a Venezuelan, let alone a foreign country, let alone Americans, it was completely unclear. What was the imminent threat and what is the plan on Sunday? Is it just leadership change, which seems to be the case right now? You have the basic contours of the same leadership still in place. Is it about regime change? Well, Trump hinted at that when he said that the United States would be in control of Venezuela, something that didn't make a lot of sense given that the Defense Department had said that they had basically exited. Or is it about something different? Democracy, possibly oil, definitely. The president said that. That hodgepodge of explanations is confusing. It suggests there was no imminent reason for doing this. But most importantly, it shows that the president never really made the case to the American public, let alone the international community. I think that's probably why tonight he's already distracted, if you follow his feed, from the efforts in Venezuela and back to domestic politics and antagonizing his political opponents rather than a focus on what happens on Sunday.
Yeah, it didn't make their case to not just the public, but to Congress as well, as we continue to see that chorus of critics, especially among Democrats, that are calling on the administration to really explain not just what led up to the operation, but to your earlier point, what its plan is long term. So let's just finally just talk broader about what we can expect in the region. I mean, what kind of instability could we maybe see in Venezuela and beyond?
I put it into 4 different buckets. I think there's the short term, which is going to be sort of the travel issues that you're seeing, travel restrictions for Americans and others. That's not new. It's just something that Americans should be aware of. I think the second is just sort of continuity of operations. The question of who is in charge also goes to who is in charge of ensuring that Venezuelans' lives are not disrupted by this, or continuity of operations continuing. I think I worry less a little bit about geopolitical stability at this stage because we simply don't know what's going to happen. But if things go bad in Venezuela, you could get migration and other pressures on surrounding countries, which would then destabilize not only South America, but of course, Central America and then Mexico and the United States. I finally think that we need to really look at supply chain issues as regards oil and other commodities that are transported. I work a lot in the business community. They're certainly focused on that. So as I'm looking at the sort of politics of what's happening in Venezuela, or what promises or confusion is emanating out of the White House right now, you're also looking at a geopolitical structure that is quite confused, and looking at the risk variables that might impact them in the days and weeks to come.
And as its successor to Venezuela's Hugo Chavez, Nicolás Maduro tightened his grip on the country for more than a decade, surviving international sanctions, political unrest, and multiple challenges to his rule. Well, that is until now. See some of this footage that was released by the White House of what the White House is describing or calling Maduro's perp walk at the DEA headquarters in New York. Maduro and his wife sit in U.S. custody following their capture and extradition on Saturday. CNN's Rafael Romo takes a closer look at the Venezuelan president's political reign.
Two men have governed Venezuela in the last 25 years. Hugo Chavez, who described his style of governing as 21st century socialism and died in 2013, handpicked Nicolás Maduro as his successor, who narrowly won an election that year. During the nearly 13 years that Nicolás Maduro had been in power, Venezuela lost 72% of its economy. An estimated 8 million Venezuelans have voted with their feet by migrating to other countries, including the United States. Maduro's politics have been a mix of anti-imperialist and anti-U.S. narrative. As Venezuela's leader and the country's power broker, he's been the face of Chavismo, a left-wing populism held over from the Chavez era. Other figures are part of this confederation of power, including Diosdado Cabello, the interior minister, and Vladimir Padrino, the defense minister. Will they and others be able to keep alive the system which enriched a lucky few at the expense of the populace? There's almost no independent media left, and those in power ignore the press or plainly refuse to answer any questions from journalists, as we found out in 2016 when we tried for months to interview Delcy Rodríguez, who, as vice president now, is constitutionally entitled to be sworn in as president in Maduro's absence.
Canciller, ¿qué dice de las alegaciones de que se venden?
Rodríguez finally reappeared Saturday afternoon, asserting that Nicolás Maduro is, quote, the only president of Venezuela, surrounded by her brother, Jorge Rodríguez, the president of the Venezuelan National Assembly, and Diosdado Cabello, the interior minister, and several military leaders. The vice president said that Venezuela, quote, will never be a colony again. The last time Venezuela had a crisis of this magnitude was an uprising in 2019. We now know that the U.S. attack targeted at least 2 airports and a port, as well as Fort Tuna, a major Venezuelan military installation. Rafael Romo, CNN, Atlanta.
And joining me now to unpack Maduro's political standing is Will Freeman. He's fellow for Latin American Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Well, it's great to have you on the program.
Thanks for having me.
So what are Maduro loyalists in Venezuela's government doing right now to respond to their leader's capture? I mean, do you see the detained Venezuelan leader's influence still playing a role in Caracas?
You know, I think a number of Maduro regime insiders, they felt that they need to pay lip service to defending him. You know, they've said this is unacceptable. They've said that they'll resist U.S. aggression. But what do we see them doing in practice? I mean, today you had Delcy Rodríguez, his vice president, quickly sworn in as the new interim president. And you had a press conference where she was flanked by all the top members of the Maduro regime hierarchy. You had the defense minister, head of the military, visit her even before that. So to me, what it looked like was basically all the remaining players banding together and, I think communicating without exactly explicitly saying it. We either survive together or we sink alone. And pretty willing and able to move on without Maduro. I mean, that's how I'm reading things. Obviously, a lot's still uncertain, but I see here an authoritarian regime which is reconfiguring itself, which wants to survive, which probably wants to cut deals with the Trump administration, and wants to avoid, above everything, being pushed by the Trump administration towards some kind of negotiated democratic transition.
Fascinating. How do you see those potential conversations playing out between the remaining members of the regime and the White House?
Well, a lot is going to depend on dynamics within the White House itself. So I think you have Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, obviously deeply personally committed to a transition here. I think that's why he's been pursuing this for the better part of his career. He very much sees Venezuela linked to Cuba and believes that if there's a transition in Venezuela, you'll also see one in Cuba, a longtime goal of his. So I think that for him, he'll push hard for this. What does President Trump want? That's more of a mystery. Today at the press conference he held, he said that there would be elections quickly, but he didn't specify an exact timeline. And he also seemed pretty open to working with Delcy Rodríguez, that vice president who's just now become the interim president in Venezuela and who's part of the Maduro regime structure. In fact, Trump put much more emphasis on oil, on getting bigger stakes for U.S. companies in the country. Could he do that with a reconfigured Maduro regime minus Maduro? I think he could, and Trump may realize that. And, whether or not he may try seriously to get a transition, he may not. If it gets difficult, if the process gets stuck, he may simply, be pragmatic here, practice some realpolitik and work with the people in place. I mean, I could really see that happening, in which case, you'd have to really do a tough benefit cost analysis here where you've had, over 100 people killed in the region. You've had U.S. personnel put at risk, a lot of U.S. taxpayer money spent. And in the end, what do you end up with? Potentially just a slightly different looking authoritarian regime doing a few more business deals with the U.S. You'd have to really ask yourself, was that worth it?
I'm glad you mentioned Acting President Delcy Rodríguez. President Trump said that his Secretary of State, that he spoke to her, that she reportedly told Marco Rubio, we're going to do whatever you need. But then also we heard from her and her description saying that the detention of a president, the extraction of a president, that it was a violation of international law, and even demanded that he be returned immediately. Can you just, with your expertise, help us understand these two different narratives?
Well, I think let's look at how this operation occurred, right? You had dozens of U.S. aircraft flying at low altitudes into Caracas, not receiving anti-aircraft fire really to speak of, doing this tactical masterstroke. To me, there's a chance that this was just, you could chalk this up to the professionalism of the U.S. military. What I really think it points to is that there was someone on the inside, possibly many people on the inside, colluding or cooperating with the U.S. government to hand over Maduro, right? And so I think right now everyone remaining in Venezuela doesn't want to be seen as that person, right, to the other regime insiders. They want to be seen as the loyalist who would have gone down, shooting would have gone down with the ship. And so, I think everyone is going to be copying that language of Delcy Rodríguez, and that's what we've seen so far. They're all going to be saying, no, I would have stood with Maduro to the end. But clearly, I think pretty clearly, someone sold him out. So we're going to keep seeing that doublespeak. I think even as likely the Delcy Rodríguez government starts to do deals with the Trump administration, we're going to still see them, making appeals to sovereignty, to resisting the U.S. But that's not going to be, what's more important is that we watch what they do in practice.
Yeah, it's likely that there is a CIA presence within Venezuela, as we learned when Trump allowed them, or at least gave them the green light to launch any covert options. I have a few seconds with you. What do you believe Maria Corina Machado, the opposition leader's next move, may be? Again, just a few seconds with you.
Unfortunately, she looks like the biggest loser today, right? So President Trump, more or less, just discarding her as a real possibility for leading the country. Now, look, I think that there is some rationale behind that. Maria Corina Machado said 20% of the armed forces in Venezuela have to go. That's very ambitious for getting a transition. That rarely happens in countries moving towards a democracy. So what could she do? I mean, I think she could try to keep the opposition united. She can contribute to this pressure for the Trump administration not to cut a dirty deal with a reconfigured dictatorship in Venezuela, but actually to push for democracy. And she can continue being a voice of moral clarity for that opposition and for the Venezuelan people. So, I think she likely will continue playing that role. The question is, will it be enough to sway President Trump?
Yeah, that she lacks support, an inaccurate claim from the commander-in-chief during that press conference. Will Freeman, I really appreciate your time and your expertise. Coverage just hours after Nicolás Maduro was transported to the United States. The Trump administration has posted this video of what it calls Nicolás Maduro's perp walk. You see the ousted Venezuelan president being escorted, his hands in handcuffs, inside the Drug Enforcement Office here in New York City. And Maduro was processed and fingerprinted there. He wishes some of the people in the room a Happy New Year, as you see in the footage. And in the wake of Saturday's American military operation to capture Nicolás Maduro, congressional leaders, they are calling for a briefing on the operation. A House Armed Services Committee aide telling CNN that the panel is in the process of planning a briefing for next week, possibly. The operation has received praise from some Republicans and near universal condemnation from some Democrats.
It is an important day for for the American people. It is a crucial day for the entire hemisphere, and it is the one thing that all of us have all been saying. We've all been saying, and you've heard me say this time and time again, that the solution, the real solution for the Venezuelan people was total, absolute democracy and freedom returning to Venezuela. And because of President Trump and the United States Armed Forces, that day has already begun.
Blood for oil. I've been saying it for weeks. This is blood for oil. It's got nothing to do with narco trafficking. The drugs are mostly going to Europe, and cocaine is not the drug that is killing Americans. That's fentanyl coming from China. This has always been about the fact that Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves, 300 billion barrels offshore. Chevron has the contract and the Treasury Department's permission to exploit those oil reserves. And this president is making good on his campaign promise to the U.S. oil majors when he told them that if they gave him $1 billion, he would hook them up. Well, he's hooking them up.
Joining us now with more on the political impacts of Maduro's capture is CNN senior political analyst and Bloomberg opinion columnist Ron Brownstein. He joins us from Los Angeles. Thank you so much for staying up late for us, Ron. Great to see you.
Good evening. Yeah.
So as you just saw some of the response from both sides of the aisle, and it's not just from some of the Democratic members of the House caucus, but let me just put up what Marjorie Taylor Greene has posted recently in response to this. The Congresswoman writing, if U.S. military action and regime change in Venezuela was really about saving American lives from deadly drugs, then why hasn't the Trump administration taken action against Mexican cartels? And of course, her post goes on there. What is your opinion, though, on American sentiment right now when it comes to what we just witnessed 24 hours ago? Do you think that the American public, that American voters in a midterm year want to see the U.S. run another country, even if it's temporary?
Yeah, well, you know, the polling on this was pretty consistent beforehand, that 60 to 70% of Americans were saying in polls that they opposed military action in Venezuela. Now, I suspect that once the action has already happened, that number will diminish somewhat and you'll get somewhat more support for it. But I would be very surprised if it was anything more than 50-50 at best. And if you kind of look a little over the horizon, I think, as you see in the Marjorie Taylor Greene statement, that gives you a good indication of why I believe the downside risk of this over time politically is much higher than the possible upside gain. I mean, if it all goes well, what the president will achieve is something that I don't think is going to matter much to a lot of Americans, which is greater access to Venezuelan oil for American oil and multinational oil companies. If it goes badly and you are involved in a sustained military action, much less kind of urban guerrilla resistance in a country that most Americans did not think was worthy of military action, then you could be looking at some very serious political consequences of the kind that George Bush suffered in his second term.
But there's also no denying just the dramatic nature of how everything has played out. I mean, just 24 hours ago, I was on air, we were talking about reports of a few explosions. Here we are 24 hours later, and you have the ousted Venezuelan leader bedding down in a Brooklyn cell. Do you see maybe a potential for Donald Trump's approval ratings to experience maybe a second wind? And if so, do you think that would actually be sustainable, though?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I mean, you know, historically there was, I mean, we talked about the public rallying around the flag whenever troops are committed. I mean, that really has attenuated in the past 20, 30 years as our politics have become more polarized. But, you know, it is possible that there will be some immediate effect like that in the wake of a successful short-term military action. The two big constraints are, you know, we really don't know exactly what the Trump administration has in mind when it says it is going to run the country, unless they believe that the successor government in Venezuela is simply going to kind of buckle under their pressure and do what they want and give concessions to American oil companies and cut off relations with Cuba, you know, essentially at the point of a spear. Unless that happens, happens, the alternatives are we don't get what what he's promising today, or we have to use force to do it. And, I think both of those are difficult political options. And then the larger overwhelming truth is that we just see month after month from the American people, their primary concern is their cost of living. Just nothing else seems to intrude on that. And I think that will certainly remain true. This military action is not something that's going to change that basic dynamic.
But look, ultimately, he also has to face Congress. Listen to what Democratic Representative Seth Moulton told CNN on Saturday. He sits on the House Armed Services Committee, as you know. He criticized the administration's handling of Venezuela, saying that essentially it lied to lawmakers.
When we had briefings on Venezuela, we asked, are you going to invade the country? We were told no. Do you plan to put troops on the ground in Venezuela? We were told no. Do you intend regime change in Venezuela? We were told no. So in a sense, we have been briefed. We've just been completely lied to.
So I have a few seconds to answer two questions here from you. Does it look like the Trump administration lied to not just Congress and the American public? And what leverage does Congress have to try to get more answers from the White House?
Well, I'm not sure the Republican majority wants more answers. I mean, I think they are going to rally around the president. Democrats certainly feel that they were lied to. You and I were not in those closed briefings. We don't know exactly what was said, but by all indications, they didn't. They kind of pushed away from the argument that they were seeking regime change. And by the way, this is why this is another one of the reasons why the rally around the flag kind of dynamic that characterized earlier, at least the initial stages of military operations in earlier generations has attenuated, because it is, even in the way the administration deals with the opposition party in Congress is adversarial on this. And there's kind of less of a buy-in for the whole country. I mean, this is, as on domestic issues, they're not really looking to build any kind of engagement or investment among Democrats. They just kind of view it as a nuisance. And, so you get what you get, which is a highly partisan reaction, not only in the Congress, but in the country. And that, I think, will limit the ultimate audience for what they are doing, especially if they have to use any kind of follow-on manifestation of American military force, any kind of sustained engagement. I'd be really surprised, Paulo, if Donald Trump has the stomach for that. I mean, there's, he probably didn't oppose the Iraq War originally, as he claimed in 2016, but he certainly came to see nation building as kind of a fool's errand, both substantively and politically. And so it will be fascinating to see if he really is willing to commit American troops on the ground in some kind of ongoing basis. There's really been no indication that he has the inclination for anything like that.
Let's not forget, we have an election coming up soon. Ron Brownstein, it's always a pleasure to get to speak to you. Venezuelans in South Florida, they're celebrating news of Nicolás Maduro's capture. These images actually coming from Doral, Florida, home to more Venezuelan immigrants than any other single place in the United States. Many are hoping that the Trump administration's actions will spark the change in Venezuela that they have been waiting decades to see. And those celebrations, they are not just happening in the U.S. Many Venezuelans around the world are happy, excited that Nicolás Maduro has been removed from power. CNN's Rafael Romo brings us some of those pictures.
Chants, joy, and tears at the heart of Madrid.
This is excitement, happiness, and hope.
Singing, dancing, and holding up their flag in South America. Venezuelans around the world have been celebrating President Nicolás Maduro's capture. Crowds gather at Doral in Florida, home to one of the largest Venezuelan communities in the U.S. Closer to home in Cúcuta, which straddles the border, this man says, "We are going to be free."
I'm happy. I don't know about the other people. My mom and my dad are happy too.
Nearly 7.9 million Venezuelans have fled Maduro's regime, according to UN figures. More than 6 million sought refuge in Latin America. Colombia is home to 2.8 million migrants, while Peru has welcomed more than 1.6 million. In Lima, many of them were up all night trying to reach their relatives.
I heard around 2 a.m. My son and my mother called me. They were crying and confused about what was happening, and all we did was to pray so they will be okay.
Hope and joy. After years of being abroad, it is a day they won't forget. Rafael Romo, CNN.
Joining me now from New York City is Nurka Melendez. She's the co-founder of Venezuelans and Immigrants Aid, a group here in New York that helps Venezuelan asylum seekers. Nurka, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you, Paulo, for the invitation and for having me.
So, Nurka, is there any sense that Maduro may be gone, but these traces of his regime, that they remain back in Caracas?
Oh yes, I mean what happened today is just we are seeing justice that is happening now with Maduro, but we know there is still the Chavez system still remaining in our country. So we are hoping that for those who are still in the country trying to keep in power, have the same future that the justice found in Maduro.
I want to show our viewers around the world some of these remarkable pictures that the White House has released where we see Maduro on U.S. soil in handcuffs. He's flanked by DEA agents. We're seeing him right now, and I'm sure you've had a chance to see some of these images. When you did see them, as somebody who is living essentially in exile in the United States and not able to return home, what went through your mind when you saw Maduro like this?
It's like a roller coaster. It's many emotions at the same time. There is still persecution. There is still political prisoners in my country. There is still people feeling fears. There is still not the possibility for us to going back to our country, but yet it's at least a light at the end of the tunnel that keeps us the hope. And what I really see behind that picture is the justice that we are, in need of seeing to start or build again our country. So that was my first reaction, that justice that I feel is coming and is getting closer to us as a Venezuelan people outside our country.
President Trump said on Saturday that the U.S. will, as he put it, will run Venezuela until a safe transition can happen. Nurka, given the U.S.'s troubled history of intervention, how much confidence do you have in the U.S.'s ability to get your country back on course? We heard from a former ambassador say that doing that, it will be a complicated task. I think that's an understatement.
Yes, it is a complicated even topic for me to digest because it's too many, political matters in between. What I see beyond that is the humanity behind this. It's just human beings, aiming for freedom. And that is what I see right now. Just hoping that the representation for our political people might be, the best fit in order to Venezuela be the ones who can just decide the future of our country. But now, what I see, even in that scenario, is just the help that we were seeking and hoping that everything is just getting back into place. Our country is in a mess. We lost our country, and now getting pieces into place, I know it's going to be a really complicated task. And again, for us, it's just the beginning, probably the beginning of the end, or the end of that beginning that we saw almost 3 decades back in our history. And I don't feel like creating expectations and guessing the future, but what we see is just a fact, and I'm hoping that is going to result in a better future for everything. Starting for building again a country that will last almost 3 decades.
Nurka, as you and nearly 8 million of your fellow Venezuelans who have left home in the last decade observe closely what will happen next, I'm curious, I wonder if we can close with what your vision is of what you see as the future of your country.
It's almost 3 decades, as I said before. It's not an easy solution, like a right away. I know this will take a lot, even in our mind, as a civil society, to escape, get rid of our own fears, it's going to be a really complicated task. And as you can tell now, it's too many pieces that we have to put again together. We have to remind us as a civil society what is to have again independent institution, starting from that, and then as a citizens of Venezuela to regain that confidence that we don't need to rely on waiting for a regime to decide what is going to be next for us, but decide for ourselves about our own future. You see, it's many things that we have to digest against as a civil society, as a citizen of our country, starting for, okay, we have again a country, let's build it together. So it's so many tasks, it's quite complicated for me because there are many emotions coming to my mind. But even having the hope that you can go back to your country, even for visiting, as I said to you in a private conversation before, it's just, wow, like a light and a human right that we even forget what is that feeling. So, it's digesting all these things again, and we have hopes. Absolutely. That is the thing that first came to my mind regarding all the events that happening in such a short time, and that is hope, and of course the commit as a citizen to be a part of this such a task that we have in front of us. Mm-hmm.
Nuka Melendez, thank you so much for continuing to share your story. These are some of the passion protests on the doorstep of the White House on Saturday. This as Americans voiced their frustration with the prospect of war and bloodshed over the oil in Venezuela. Also in New York, more demonstrators carrying the message, no war on Venezuela. They were on the streets just hours after President Trump announced the capture of Nicolás Maduro and his wife. And then, of course, the impact of people inside of Venezuela. There's long lines for shoppers. They're waiting to check out at this supermarket in Caracas. Venezuelans are coming to grips with a new and uncertain reality with their leader captured by the United States and President Trump promising to run their country. Some businesses, including pharmacies, grocery stores, and gas stations, they simply decided to just remain closed.
Ousted Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife now on U.S. soil after the two were captured in a large-scale U.S. military operation. Maduro arriving at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn in just the last hour, where he's set to face drug and weapons charges in New York this week. U.S. President Donald Trump says the U.S. will, quote, run the country for now and take control of Venezuela's massive oil reserves.
To run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. So we don't want to be involved with having somebody else get in, and we have the same situation that we had for the last long period of years. So we are going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. And it has to be judicious, because that's what we're all about.
The White House releasing these photos, which show President Trump there and members of his national security team watching the operation unfold in the early hours Saturday. The president said he is open to putting U.S. troops on the ground to help secure Venezuela's oil. Meantime, in a new indictment, prosecutors accused Maduro of running state-sponsored gangs and facilitating drug trafficking over a number of years. President Trump telling reporters the U.S. is working with Venezuelan Vice President Delcy Rodríguez, who has been calling for Maduro's release.
We demand the immediate release of President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, the only president of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
CNN's Evan Perez is outside the detention center where Maduro is being held. So just bring us up to speed at this point, Evan, in terms of what is happening inside the detention center and what is next for Maduro.
Yeah, Erica, it's been a remarkable 20 hours or so in the life of Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Cilia. They were brought here in the last hour to the Metropolitan Detention Center here on the Brooklyn waterfront, about 20 hours or so after they were snatched from their bedroom in Caracas. And, the process, the logistics of getting them here is nothing short of extraordinary. Of course, they were brought first to to a military ship off the coast of Venezuela, the Iwo Jima. From there, they were transferred to Guantanamo Bay, the U.S. facility there, and then put on a plane to New York. And they were processed in downtown Manhattan at the DEA facility, the DEA field office there. And then they were helicoptered over here to Brooklyn, where he is now sitting a prisoner of the United States. Now, where we are here on the Brooklyn waterfront, just until a short while ago, there were a few hundred people, mostly from the Venezuelan community, who had gathered here, very cheering, very loudly at the prospect, at the arrival of the former Venezuelan president. There's still quite a few of them who are still standing here at this hour, but certainly, inside this facility, which has a fairly notorious reputation. It is known to be a very cold place. There's problems with rat infestation. It's not a very nice place, so it's quite a change for the Venezuelan president, who is now in here. Now, this begins the process in the U.S. justice system for the former president and his wife. They are facing 4 sets of charges, including narco-terrorism and cocaine importation conspiracy. There are a number of other Venezuelan officials who are on this indictment that was unsealed by the Justice Department earlier today. And we expect that we will next see Maduro and his wife in federal court in Manhattan on Monday. That's when the federal charges will be officially read to them, and perhaps we'll have an arraignment proceeding where we may hear whether they have a plea or not. Again, we don't know yet from the court whether how this will go down on Monday, but that will begin what will be probably several months and perhaps more than a year of legal proceedings. We expect that the former Venezuelan president is going to make a defense, including, of course, that he believes these charges are not valid, that his abduction from Venezuela is illegal. Those are all things that are going to go before the federal court. But it is a remarkable turn here in Brooklyn. It's all quiet now. This is where the DEA and the FBI and NYPD to that side of the building. Again, there's a large crowd of the local Venezuelan community that had shown up here in anticipation of it. And depending on where they brought him, he might have been able to hear some of the cheers that was going up from the crowd here, Erica.
Yeah, absolutely. It is quite a turn of events, as you pointed out, Evan. Appreciate it. I also want to bring in now CNN's Julia Benbrook and Kylie Atwood, who are both joining me now live from Washington at this hour. Julia, as we look at where things stand with the White House, a lot of questions, certainly after the president's press conference earlier this morning, where we did not get a lot of answers about what these next steps are and, frankly, what the president means by the U.S. running Venezuela. What more are we hearing from the White House tonight?
Yeah, Erica, a lot of questions remain here, but I want to take a step back and look at what we have heard from the White House throughout the day. Of course, there were reports of these explosions that took place in Venezuela, specifically impacting the capital city of Caracas. And then you see President Donald Trump take to social media. This was a Truth Social post, a relatively short one for him, where he did say the United States was behind this large-scale attack on Venezuela and its leader, Nicolás Maduro. He also, in that post, made the stunning reveal that Maduro and his wife had been captured and removed from the country. Now, Trump has been at Mar-a-Lago, his resort there in Florida, spending the holiday, and that is where he actually did watch part of this complex operation take place. He said it was like watching a television show. This is also where we heard him speak to reporters about what took place. He praised the operation. In fact, he said this exactly. He said, one of the most stunning, effective, and powerful displays of American military might and competence in American history. He then said that the United States would, quote, run the country until a judicious transition can happen. But that is where there are a lot of key questions. He was pressed repeatedly by reporters during this press conference on that. He did at one point say that the people standing behind him, some of these top members of his administration, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, that they would be a part of this process, but no real timeline and no really concrete way to look at this going forward. He was also asked specifically about Venezuela's opposition leader and the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Maria Corina Machado, and if his team had spoken with her specifically, what he thought about her potential ability to lead. And I want you to take a listen to those back and forth there.
Yes.
Is the U.S. aware of the location of opposition leader Machado, and have you been in contact with her?
No, we haven't. No, we haven't. Oh, I think it would be very tough for her to be the leader. She doesn't have the support within, or the respect within the country. She's a very nice woman, but she doesn't have the respect to be the leader.
Now, during that same press conference, Trump did say that the United States was working with Venezuela's Vice President, Delcy Rodríguez. She, though, has called for the immediate release of Maduro and has said that she believes he is the legitimate leader of the country. Erica.
Yes, there's certainly some pushback there from the vice president. Kylie, as I bring you in here, what's fascinating, not only the president's response when he was asked about Maria Corina Machado, but also reporting from our colleague Jim Sciutto earlier tonight that other governments had been in touch, in fact, with some of those opposition party leaders. What is the level of understanding, on a broader level about what this means in terms of the leadership of Venezuela and the security implications, Kylie, moving forward?
Well, Erica, at this moment, we really don't know who the United States, who the Trump administration views as the legitimate leader of Venezuela. In recent months, early on in the Trump administration, they had referred to one of the opposition leaders as the rightful president of Venezuela. But over the course of the last few months, we have really seen the administration somewhat distance itself from members of the opposition. We know that there's still contact that the Trump administration had with the opposition, but in our reporting, we found out that the Trump administration had been planning for what the day after would actually look like inside Venezuela if Maduro was ousted. And I was told during the course of that reporting that the opposition's day after planning was not one that was sanctioned by the Trump administration. Effectively, that the Trump administration was working on its own day after planning, sort of indicating that they were running these parallel efforts to try and break Venezuela free from Nicolás Maduro's rule, but not necessarily to put the opposition in control of the country. So we really have to watch and see what happens here. But we did learn in remarkable detail today how this military operation was carried out. Most of those details were shared by General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as he stood next to President Trump down in Florida today. He said it was at 10:46 p.m. last night. That is almost exactly 24 hours ago, Erica, that President Trump gave the green light for this operation to begin taking place. And then it was around 2 in the morning local time when the U.S. military actually arrived at the compound, that extraction team via helicopters, according to Dan Kane, that were shot at, but they weren't actually taken down. And I want you to listen to some more details that the general provided during that briefing earlier today.
It involved more than 150 aircraft launching across the Western Hemisphere in close coordination, all coming together in time and place to layer effects for a single purpose, to get an interdiction force into downtown Caracas. After months of work by our intelligence teammates to find Maduro and understand how he moved, where he lived, where he traveled, what he ate, what he wore, what were his pets. In early December, our force was set pending a series of aligned events.
Now, of course, questions over what the U.S. military role will be here going forward, as there are questions about what the actual political ramifications, the political leadership in Venezuela is going to look like. President Trump did say that the U.S. is not afraid of boots in the ground in Venezuela, but said that they would be there to secure the oil. We'll have to watch and see how this all plays out. Erica?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of questions tonight. Kylie, Julia, appreciate it. Thank you both. In the wake of Saturday's military operations to capture Nicolás Maduro, congressional leaders are calling for a briefing on that operation. House Armed Services Committee telling CNN the panel is in the process of planning a briefing for next week. Meantime, Secretary of State Marco Rubio here talking about the decision by the administration to not notify nor to seek approval from Congress. Take a listen.
We called members of Congress immediately after. This was not the kind of mission that you can do congressional notification on. It was a trigger-based mission in which conditions had to be met night after night. We watched and monitored that for a number of days. So it's just simply not the kind of mission you can call people and say, hey, we may do this at some point in the next 15 days.
Joining me now, a member of the House Armed Services Committee, Democratic Congressman Gil Cisneros. Congressman, it's good to have you with us tonight. I should point out you're also a Navy veteran, former Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness. When you hear from the Secretary of State that this is, quote, not the kind of mission that you can do a notification on, does that make you feel better about where things stand and and what Congress was not told?
No, Congress is not the problem. The House Armed Services problem is not the problem with leaks. Their own Secretary of Defense in the Trump administration is the one who has leaked information out to the public, who is told about operations that had happened in the past. That's where the leaks come from. They have a responsibility to notify Congress what is going to happen. And pretty much the Secretary of State lied to the House of Representatives when he came and told us that they would not seek military action without the approval of Congress, and that's exactly what they did.
And so what is the follow-on for that from your vantage point?
Well, they need to come to us. They need to tell us what the plans are. I'm very disturbed by the president's press conference where he did say in the fact that he is willing to put boots on the ground. He doesn't have the authorization from Congress to do that. He has not come to us to talk about his plan. He has said that now he is going to be running, Venezuela, and basically tried to gave Marco Rubio another job there. He's already Secretary of State. He's already the National Security Advisor, and I guess he's going to be running the puppet regime that Donald Trump wants to put in place in Venezuela. And so they need to come into Congress and explain what their intentions are, what their plan is, and really explain, how are they going to do this, right? It's very disturbing what they did, and they need to answer. So a lot of these questions, all this press conference did was just bring forth more questions, both from Congress and as well as the media, and they need to have answers for those.
So just two things to pick on, Bevan, there on what you're saying. You say you want them to come to Congress, you want them to brief Congress. What is your level of confidence that that is going to happen?
Oh, it's not. I don't have any level of confidence that it's going to happen. I think they will come in here. They will tell us things that basically are already out there in the press, information they've already kind of put out there. They're going to try and spin this as it was bringing somebody to justice, bringing them through the courts. But this is really about, at the heart of it, it is about regime change. It is about Donald Trump getting his hands on oil, the Venezuelan oil, and him, basically, it's my opinion, he wants to bring this oil into the United States so he can flood the market and bring down the price of gas.
So you say you believe this is all about oil. The president, as we just heard from him, said he doesn't have a problem with sending U.S. troops in to protect that oil. When we talk about, though, who is going to be leading the country, and that is a question that many of us have unanswered tonight, as you pointed out, and as our reporters have tried to get an answer from the president earlier today. My colleague Kylie Atwood just talking about this day after planning, that there were essentially parallel efforts happening. Based on comments that you just made to me, do you believe that the administration is actively working to put in a form of rulers, right? Some sort of administration or leaders, that is part of the effort here, part of what would be the U.S. running the country? And if so, who do you envision that is?
I do not have any idea who they are envisioning or what they're going to do or what their plan is. That is not something they have shared with us. But I believe the president wants to put in a puppet regime that is going to let him have access to the oil so that he can bring it into the United States. And as I said, bring down the price of gasoline. That's my belief. That's what this is all about. This is about regime change. It had nothing to do with narcotics or drugs, even though that was kind of what they did at the beginning. This is really about oil and trying to get somebody in there who will allow him to have access to that. And that's why I believe he's not really working with the opposition party and said that, she wouldn't be right. The opposition party and the opposition leader wouldn't be right to have them come in, because they're not going to allow him to have access to the oil. That oil, those oil reserves belong to the Venezuelan people. It is for them to decide what needs to be done with that, not for the United States.
Real quickly, sir, before I let you go, in your conversations, maybe even just your background conversations with your Republican colleagues in Washington, are they concerned, even privately? Do they share some of your concerns? We've heard a lot of public support today.
I think my Republican colleagues, it's like Jekyll and Hyde, right? In private, they say one thing. In public, it's something else. I haven't talked to any of my Republican colleagues today. I'm sure we'll have some conversations when we go back, but I'm sure they have concerns in private, but they're not going to make those concerns known in public.
Congressman Gil Cisnero, we appreciate your time tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Taking a look now at the White House, the scene earlier today of protests, as you can see here, over the U.S. military action in Venezuela. Protests not just in Washington, D.C., but a number of other American cities as well. That's next. We have the vice president in Venezuela pushing back, calling for Maduro's release. How could the U.S. run the country if they're not currently controlling it?
Well, that's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. In his press conference, I think it was Marco Rubio said that she'd been sworn in as president, and almost immediately after, Delcy Rodríguez, the vice president of Venezuela, said, no, she's just the acting president. That as far as she was concerned, Nicolás Maduro is still the president of the country. So clearly, there's some miscommunication going on.
Miscommunication, what does it tell you as well about the administration's planning for this day after?
My assumption is that they don't want to put troops on the ground. It would take thousands. It's a huge country, 30 million people, twice the size of California. So the number of troops that would require would be gigantic. And I think they are hoping to maintain security through Delcy Rodríguez, the vice president of Venezuela, Maduro's illegitimate vice president of Venezuela, and the Venezuelan army, the existing Venezuelan army. I think they don't want to repeat what happened in Iraq, where we disbanded the Iraqi army. But then how that works is not clear to me, and that seems like that's going to be a very, very difficult needle to thread.
And just give us a sense for people who are not familiar, what the level is what the level of loyalty is, not just when it comes to Delcy Rodríguez, right, but when it comes to the military in terms of their loyalty to Maduro.
Well, that's the key question. For 20 years, I have been hearing that the Venezuelan military is about to overthrow first Chavez and then Maduro. I've been hearing for 20 years. It's difficult. The Venezuelan people voted overwhelmingly for the opposition in the elections of July 2024. How many of those people are, absolutely opposition supporters, or they're just dissatisfied with the economic situation in a country where the economy has collapsed? I can't tell you. But that leaves at least 20%, maybe more of the population, that supports Maduro, that is benefiting from the Maduro government's programs, that works for the government, is part of the military, part of the police. And how you win those people over and turn that around is going to be very, very difficult. In addition, there are at least 2 different Colombian guerrilla groups operating in Venezuela, and these are trained combatants. So, I mean, you've got a very complicated situation, and clearly you need to be able to maintain security in Venezuela while this transition takes place.
Mm-hmm. You also, so we have all of that playing out on the ground. When you talk about the opposition party, it was fascinating today to see President Trump really distance himself from the opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, who, of course, had praised him most recently when she won the Nobel Peace Prize, saying she dedicated it to him. But President Trump today saying she doesn't have the support, she doesn't have the respect within the country. How much weight do you think Donald Trump's words carry with the people of Venezuela?
Well, I mean, I was surprised to hear him be so dismissive of her. I mean, she's the woman who just won the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo earlier in December. She is the most respected opposition politician in Venezuela. And the opposition is barely unified. I mean, it was a huge Herculean task to unify the opposition. I mean, they are essentially all the parties in the country from right to left who existed before Hugo Chavez came to office in 1999. So it'd be like making the Republicans and the Democrats work together against a new party. And they don't like each other. They've got grudges against each other. It's been hard for them to work together. And she's the one who brought them together.
Yeah, it's really something. A lot to watch there. Really appreciate your insight and your expertise, and we'll certainly be calling on you in the coming days and weeks. Charles Shapiro, thank you.
Thank you so much, Erica.
Envision the U.S. military having a presence in Venezuela as the U.S. runs that
well,
country?
no, we're going to have a presence in Venezuela as it pertains to oil, because we have to have, we're sending our expertise in. So you may need something, not very much. But no, we're going to be taking out a tremendous amount of wealth out of the ground. And that wealth is going to the people of Venezuela and people from outside of Venezuela that used to be in Venezuela. And it goes also to the United States of America in the form of reimbursement for the damages caused us by that country.
Hours after the U.S. military deposed Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, Donald Trump laying out his plans there for that country's vast oil reserve, saying, as you just heard, that his administration plans to partner with U.S. energy companies to take control of Venezuela's oil infrastructure. It's estimated Venezuela is sitting on a fifth of the world's reserve of crude oil. Unlocking it would, of course, have a massive benefit for the U.S. industry. Donald Trump also claims the U.S. is actually owed, as you heard there, some of its wealth. Venezuelans in South Florida, you see here, they are celebrating the news of Nicolás Maduro's capture. These images coming to us from Doral, Florida, which is home to more Venezuelan immigrants than any other single place in the United States. A number of them hoping the Trump administration's actions will spark the change in Venezuela they have been waiting decades to see. CNN's Juan Carlos Lopez joining me now from Miami. It's so good to have you here to walk us through. First of all, in terms of what we are seeing from the Venezuelan diaspora, what is the reaction today? Is it pretty similar to what we were seeing there with those folks in Doral?
Doral is a city that has a high concentration of Venezuelans, although there's been people leaving after the immigration raids by the Trump administration. But the hope for many is that with Maduro gone, things will change, but everyone's holding their breath because Maduro is gone, but things haven't really changed.
There are questions, too. I mean, we're hours into this, but there are questions about not only who will be leading the country, right, but who can actually hold the country together. What is your sense tonight about the potential power struggle that we could be watching unfold?
Well, the first step is that we just saw the equivalent to the Venezuelan Supreme Court order Vice President Delcy Rodríguez, who was very close to Maduro, to assume as president in charge. So she is the one holding power. Remember, President Trump this afternoon said they were in talks with her, and that as long as she did what the U.S. wanted her to do, she would be in power. And then she came out with a statement saying that Maduro is the only president of Venezuela, and allegedly, apparently, being very clear about her loyalty to him. So we don't know if there's something happening behind closed doors, but she did speak to Secretary of State Rubio. So right now, it's all very confusing.
It is very confusing, and our colleague Kylie Atwood laying out for us just a short time ago that there seem to be almost parallel efforts happening here when it comes to the day after. Efforts by the U.S., efforts by the opposition party there in Venezuela. The fact that this is not being coordinated, or at least not that we know of because we've been given so few answers, how is that being received in the broader region?
It's very confusing because President Trump himself, now you've probably heard of Maria Corina Machado, who recently received the Nobel Peace Prize, opposition leader. She was not a presidential candidate. She wasn't allowed. She was banned by the Maduro regime. But she supported Edmundo Gonzalez, who, according to all information available, won the election in 2024, only to have it stolen by Maduro. But President Trump today said that she did not have the respect of the country and she couldn't lead it. So that's also generating a very bizarre scenario where the person who many see would be the natural leader in a future Venezuela is considered not able to lead by President Trump. And then President Trump and Secretary Rubio mentioned Delcy Rodríguez, who is very close to Maduro. So Maduro's people are still running the government in Venezuela, even though the U.S. president said that the U.S. would be running the country. So far, it's an unpredictable scenario.
Yeah, it certainly is. So many questions and more questions than answers, but really appreciate you giving us at least a better understanding of the situation there. Juan Carlos Lopez, thank you. Also joining us this hour, Juan Carlos Pinzon, who's former Colombian defense minister and also former ambassador to the United States. I should note you are also running for president in Colombia. I know that you're no fan of Nicolás Maduro. Do you see his capture and what we've seen in terms of this indictment that was unveiled, do you see that having a real impact on the drug trade?
Erika, good evening. I think it's very important what just happened for freedom, for democracy, and for most of the Venezuelan people. Let's not forget that Maduro became a dictator. He even stole elections in front of everybody else. And not only that, but he partnered with criminals, with organized crime, and of course, all that created a major confusion and a fact that Venezuela became a narco regime, a narco-communist regime, which is very bad for their people and for countries like Colombia and other countries in Latin America. He was harboring terrorists from ELN, FARC, and other criminals. And of course, from that, projecting all kinds of problems, diseases, violence into a country like Colombia that was attacked, its armed forces and its people by people supported by Maduro. So I think it's a healthy event for democracy. It's important. Now, how this develops is very important to see. I guess in the coming weeks, there will be some level of transition of government. I imagine and I understand that those that are still related to the regime are in place just to keep order and to keep stability, but somehow their mission is to transfer into a process of transition to some kind of junta or joint government that allows a real transition to democracy some months from now. I think that's the scenario we should look at. And I expect international community to promote this, to promote a peaceful transfer of power.
So you want the international community to as you just said, promote that peaceful transfer of power. But is it clear to you what the plan is? The fact that the president, this morning, President Trump, could not explain what he meant by the U.S. would run the country, could not give specifics, and that there is, we're sort of seeing a little bit of pushback, I think is fair to say, from the vice president there in Venezuela, who's saying it's time for you, to release Maduro. It doesn't sound like there was a real plan. Are you confident that there's a plan?
Well, nobody knows what's going to happen after. Let's say this is very unique.
Does someone know what's going to happen in this situation, given how volatile the situation already is in Venezuela?
It's hard to determine, but I think that we have to imagine the following. Those that are in power know already the level of strength and force that was used. Eventually, they could be killed last night, and they were not. And the reason was because they gave them the opportunity to have a process of transition of power. And I think this is important now. Who will be the transfer to? That's a big question. I understand will be people that will be on the interest of the United States, but can be acceptable to do this in a peaceful way. And I estimate that, sometime from now, the real democratic process will begin, and people like Maria Corina Machado, President González Urrutia should come and influence and make all these the future of Venezuela that all of us want. Now, the other important event that happened about this is the clear signal to other dictators or to other governments that are promoting or facilitating organized crime or transnational crime. That is clear now, that is unacceptable, and that has consequences. And I think this is very important even for the current president of my own country and other leaders that took for granted the fact that they could talk easily with organized crime without consequence.
Are you saying you believe that the current president of Colombia is now a target for the administration?
Well, you got to see what President Trump said today. He was very specific about that when he was asked. And I'm saying now that every government in Latin America should understand that it's not fair game to be a democracy, but at the same time to be connected with drug trafficking or with organized crime or with terrorist organizations. And I think this is an important message. As I become president of Colombia, the clear thing that I will do as I was Minister of Defense is fight strongly and clearly drug trafficking and criminals, but for one main reason, protecting Colombians. Protecting Colombians so we can have investment, so we can have progress, we can have corporations, and we don't make our country a pariah, which is what really happened with the Venezuelan regime.
Really quickly, because we're just about out of time, do you have any concerns about the very clear focus that President Trump has on the oil in Venezuela, which seems to be a major focus? It's not just about drugs or regime change.
Well, if I think and we remember, the Chinese were taking a lot of oil from Venezuela as part of deals. The same did other countries, and also critical minerals. So it's evident that Venezuela has a very important set of reserves, both on oil and gas and on minerals. What is important now is that the proceeds of those riches come back for the benefit of Venezuelan people, not for the benefit of a corrupt regime that was using that money only to hold power, even and despite human rights violations and more than 8 million Venezuelans that were expelled from the country in a very dramatic way.
What is being done to Venezuela is barbaric. Besieging and blockading the country is an atrocity that violates all mechanisms of the international human rights system.
That is the Venezuelan Vice President Delcy Rodríguez speaking after the U.S. captured President Maduro. A Venezuelan court has now directed Rodríguez to assume the powers and duties of acting president. She has called Maduro's detention a, quote, kidnapping and also demanded his release, adding Maduro is, quote, the sole president of Venezuela. Those comments appear to fly in the face of an earlier statement from President Trump, who said Rodríguez was ready to work with the United States. For more, Paula Newton joins us now live from Ottawa as we learn more about her. I mean, who is she, Paula?
She has been a defender of Chavismo for about 2 decades now. And when you're a Venezuelan, whether you supported the Maduro regime or not, you have to think that, yes, the president is gone, but his regime, now headed by Delcy Rodríguez, is very much in place. No one better than Delcy Rodríguez to really have that symbol that things may not have changed in Venezuela, even though President Maduro is gone. Just hours after the dramatic extraction of her president by U.S. forces, Venezuelan Vice President Delcy Rodríguez was the picture of defiance. Surrounded by regime loyalists, she called the U.S. operation barbaric, declaring Nicolás Maduro is the only president of Venezuela. Known to many in the country simply as Delcy, Rodríguez has been an influential and reliable regime enforcer for nearly 2 decades. She began in the government of Hugo Chavez, faithfully implementing the tenets of Chavismo, the nationalist populist movement that brought the Venezuelan economy to its knees. When Chavez died in 2013, she remained an assertive voice within President Maduro's government. Uncompromising in her rhetoric, she vilified the Venezuelan opposition and frequently warned the country about the threat of foreign intervention. Crucially, as energy minister, she also has been a steady hand in funneling Venezuela's dwindling energy revenues to the regime. Seen here last month with state workers, she says, "We have something to tell Mr. Trump. Venezuela doesn't owe the U.S. anything." And yet, Rodriguez has for many years been sanctioned by Canada, the EU, and the United States. CNN attempted to question her in 2016 after a CNN investigation uncovered a scheme to illegally sell Venezuelan passports out of the country's embassy in Iraq. Rodriguez, then the foreign minister, refused to comment to CNN on every occasion. In keeping with her political pedigree, Rodriguez has a less than subtle message for the Trump administration as she demanded Maduro's release. Her involvement in any future transition in Venezuela will be challenging. And that address that you heard from Delcy Rodríguez might also be performative. I have seen this so many times from her and other people in the regime. They may say one thing, but are actually acting on another. The other thing is the connection to the oil industry, specifically Chevron. Keep in mind that the U.S. oil giant has an exemption from the U.S. government to have operations in Venezuela, and Delcy Rodríguez has gone out of her way to ensure that she, as the energy minister as well, can protect those American assets in Venezuela. It is very interesting.
This hour, ousted Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife are now on U.S. soil after being captured in a large-scale U.S. military operation. Maduro and his wife arriving at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn earlier this evening. U.S. President Donald Trump says the U.S. will, in his words, run the country for now and also take control of Venezuela's massive oil reserves.
We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. So we don't want to be involved with having somebody else get in, and we have the same situation that we had for the last long period of years. So we are going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. And it has to be judicious because that's what we're all about.
The president, though, light on those details in terms of what it would actually entail. Meantime, the White House releasing these photos which show President Trump and members of his national security team watching the operation unfold in the early hours of Saturday morning. He said he is open to putting U.S. troops on the ground to help secure Venezuela's oil. Maduro, meantime, is facing drug and weapons charges in New York. In a newly unsealed indictment, prosecutors accuse Maduro of running state-sponsored gangs and facilitating drug trafficking. President Trump telling reporters the U.S. military could have killed Maduro during its overnight operation.
He was trying to get into a safe place. You know, the safe place is all steel. And he wasn't able to make it to the door because our guys were so fast. They went through the opposition so fast. There was a lot of gunfire. You saw some of it today. But he was trying to get to a safe place, which wasn't safe because we would have had the door blown up in about 47 seconds, they say on average, regardless of how thick the steel was. It was a very thick door. It was a very heavy door, but he was unable to get to that door. He made it to the door. He was unable to close it.
Joining us now with more from Washington, CNN's Julia Benbrook. So, Julia, as we lay out what we do and what we don't know, first of all, what do we know about not only the operation and how it unfolded, but what the day after planning is at this point?
Well, we are getting a first glimpse at the ousted Venezuelan leader Maduro as he is here on United States soil. The White House Rapid Response Twitter account, they posted a video of what appears to be a perp walk. He is walking with officials on a blue carpet. It has DEA branding on it. And I want to play it for you because he does appear to speak here at the end.
Good night. Happy New Year.
So we believe that he says there, good night, happy new year. Not entirely sure what to take from that, being some of the potentially first words that we are hearing from him after this just stunning turn of events that took place today. But to answer your question, I do want to step back and take a look at what we have heard from the White House throughout the day. There were, of course, those reports of explosions in Venezuela, specifically impacting the capital city. And following that, President Donald Trump, he took to his Truth Social account, where we often hear big announcements from him. But this was a relatively brief post where he did say the United States was behind these strikes on Venezuela and its leader. He also at that time made the announcement that Maduro and his wife had been captured and removed from the country. He later said that he watched that complex operation take place. He did that from Mar-a-Lago. That's where he has been spending the holiday. And then he spoke with press, also from Mar-a-Lago, later in the day. And this really led to some more questions, as he said the United States would run the country until there is a judicious transition. He was pressed, what exactly does this process look like? He did say that the people standing behind him, you can see them lining up there, would play a role in this. That, of course, includes top administration officials, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. But it wasn't entirely clear how all of this would play out. He was also pressed on if his team had been in contact with Venezuela's opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, and how he could potentially, if he could potentially, see her leading in the future. Let's listen to that exchange. Provides a lot of interesting context here.
Yes.
Is the U.S. aware of the location of opposition leader Machado, and have you been in contact with her?
No, we haven't. No, we haven't. Oh, I think it would be very tough for her to be the leader. She doesn't have the support within, or the respect within the country. She's a very nice woman, but she doesn't have the respect to be the leader.
So clearly not fully throwing support in that direction. During that press